Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. It was just after 4 in the morning when I noticed something was off. I usually woke up around then anyway, out of habit more than need. I'd been a dairy farmer my whole life, and cows don't really care what time the clock says. They want to be fed when they want to be fed. That morning I stepped out onto the porch with my jacket half buttoned, planning to check the barn before sunrise. The air was cool, damp in that way late summer mornings can be, with a low haze still hanging over the pasture. The yard light buzzed faintly behind me, throwing a circle of yellow over the gravel. I could see my herd out at the edge of the north field, all bunched together. That wasn't normal. Cows don't usually group up like that unless there's a storm coming or a coyote skulking around or sometimes nothing at all. But they were pressed shoulder to shoulder right against the far fence line, facing the same way, not moving. I pulled my boots on all the way and walked out there, flashlight in hand. The grass was wet enough that it soaked my jeans by the knees. I kept expecting them to shift when they saw me, or at least turn their heads. Nothing. Dozens of animals standing tight, looking straight up. It's hard to explain how wrong that felt. You spend enough time around livestock and you get to know their moods like you'd know a dog's. When they're scared, they move. They back up. They push against each other. They moo and stamp. But mine were silent. They were staring. I slowed down because some part of me realized before I did that it wasn't just the cows acting strange. The whole field was quiet. Usually even at night, you'll hear something. Crickets, frogs, an owl way off in the tree line. That morning, it was just the sound of my own boots and the occasional huff of breath from one of the cows. The silence carried weight. When I reached the fence line, I hesitated and finally did what they were doing. I looked up. At first, I didn't see it. The sky was clear except for a faint haze, stars scattered overhead. Then, after a second, I realized part of the sky wasn't moving the way it should. There was a shape there, black against black, just enough different that I could trace it if I didn't blink. It was triangular, or close to it, with edges that weren't sharp so much as blurred, like the haze was thicker along its outline. The thing was drifting over the pasture slow, too slow for a plane, no sound at all. The quiet wasn't broken, not even a hum. If anything, it felt like the air was being smothered. I stood there with my hand on the fence rail, the flashlight forgotten in the grass, and just watched. The shape blocked out a handful of stars as it moved. I couldn't tell how high it was. Some tricks of perspective made it seem huge 1 second, then closer and smaller the next. If I'd had to guess, I'd say it was maybe the size of the barn, but higher than the tallest trees at the far edge of the property. The cows never moved. Their heads stayed tilted, eyes glassy in the dark. Every so often, one would shift its weight or flick its ear, but otherwise they were locked in place. I thought about running back to the house for my phone. I wanted proof, even though I didn't know who I'd show it to. But I didn't move. Something about it kept me frozen there. Not fear exactly. I wasn't panicking, but a kind of weight in my chest that made me not want to break the moment. After maybe 30 seconds, maybe longer, the shape kept moving until it slid past the far tree line. The second it was gone, the cows shifted. It wasn't dramatic. They just sort of let out a low noise together, almost like a sigh, and started moving away from the fence. Within a minute, they were spread back out in the field, walking slow, tails flicking. Normal again. I stayed where I was another 5 minutes, straining my eyes at the sky, waiting for something else. Nothing. The stars looked normal. The silence broke. A cricket started up, then another. The night sounds came back like somebody had turned up the volume on the world. I picked up my flashlight, though I didn't switch it on, and walked back to the house. I tried to make myself believe it had been some trick of light, or maybe a weird cloud formation I'd imagine into a shape because of the cow's behavior. But I knew what I'd seen, even if I didn't have words for it. The rest of the morning went on like usual. I milked, fed, checked the fences. The cows acted like nothing had happened. But that image of them, shoulder to shoulder, staring straight up with their ears flat, has stuck with me more than the shape itself. It was like they'd been waiting for it, or they'd seen it before and knew what it was. I never told Maria, my wife. She'd only ask why I didn't come wake her, and I didn't have a good answer. Maybe I didn't want to break whatever spell was over me out there. For days afterward, I'd catch myself going out after dark, standing by the fence staring up. I didn't see it again. The cows never repeated that behavior. Life went back to normal. But that morning sits in my head like a stone, heavy and impossible to explain. It was past 1 in the morning when it happened. Me and Kyle had left Marcy's place after one of her low-key Friday hangouts. We didn't stay late often, but we'd gotten caught up talking about some movie, and the time slipped by. Neither of us had a car then, and it wasn't worth calling an Uber for the 10-minute walk back to our side of town. The air was cool, a little damp like it might rain later, and the streets were empty. We cut through Maple Avenue, which is one of those stretches of cracked sidewalks and half-working streetlights. A couple of them flickered while we passed, buzzing faintly, but it was mostly dark. I had my hoodie up and my hands stuffed in my pockets. Kyle was a step ahead, carrying the leftovers Marcy had shoved at us in a foil tray. We weren't talking much by then, just the kind of tired quiet that comes when the night's over. About halfway down the block, I noticed something weird on the pavement. My shadow stretched long in front of me, which made no sense because the nearest streetlight was behind us. I stopped walking and looked down harder, like maybe I was imagining it. But it wasn't just me. Kyle's shadow stretched the opposite way, toward me, like we were being lit from 2 different angles at once. "Dude," I said, pointing. He stopped and looked down, then back at me, then back at the ground. What the hell? Our shadows overlapped in this strange way, pulling toward each other from opposite sides. For a second, I thought maybe a car was coming, headlights sweeping across us, but there was no sound, no engine, no glow moving along the street. Everything was still. We both turned upward at the same time. Nothing. Just a clear night sky, the faint glow of the town, a few blocks, some clouds way off near the horizon. No plane lights, no drone buzzing overhead, nothing at all. I remember the silence most. It wasn't total. I could hear a distant dog barking, the hum of a refrigerator in one of the houses, but it was thick, like the air was holding still. "Okay, that's creepy," Kyle muttered. He pulled out his phone, but the screen didn't come on. He tapped the button a few times, shook it, muttered something about his battery dying. I reached for mine and had the same problem. The screen lit up for half a second, then went black. Both of our phones dead at the same time, even though I knew mine had been at 70% when we left. That made us both uneasy. We stood there in the middle of the sidewalk, shadows stretching in those impossible directions, dead phones in our hands. Neither of us said it, but I think we both felt the urge to just keep walking. So we did. As soon as we moved, our shadows snapped back to normal, stretching behind us like they should, lit by the streetlight at the end of the block. We both stopped again, looking down, then back up. Still nothing in the sky. Kyle let out this half-nervous laugh. "Guess we're sleep-deprived or something?" I didn't answer because I wasn't convinced. My skin felt tight, like every hair on my arms was standing up. I told him I wanted to get off Maple and cut through the park instead. It wasn't exactly shorter, but it felt better than walking that same stretch of sidewalk with the streetlights sputtering. The park was even darker. The lamps there had been busted for years, so it was just patches of moonlight between the trees. Our footsteps on the gravel path sounded way too loud. About halfway through, I heard something overhead. Not loud, not even distinct, just this soft rushing sound like wind moving fast but in one concentrated spot. I stopped and glanced up. Again, nothing, just black sky and scattered stars. Kyle froze too. "You heard that?" I said. My voice sounded thin in the dark. We stood there until it faded. It didn't trail off like a plane. It just stopped. Then the park lights, the ones that had been broken for as long as I could remember, flickered on all at once. Not bright, just a weak orange glow that buzzed overhead. They stayed on maybe 10 seconds before shutting back off. We were left blinking in the dark again. Kyle swore under his breath and started walking faster. I followed. Neither of us said much until we were out of the park and back onto regular streets. That's when I noticed the weirdest part. As we passed the row of houses on Birch Street, motion lights started tripping ahead of us, one after the other, like something was moving just out of sight. The lights would blink on in the yard ahead, then go dark as we passed, then the next one would flare. It wasn't in sync with our movement. It was always one house ahead, like something invisible was pacing us. Kyle saw it too. He kept glancing from the yards to me, waiting for me to say something. But what was there to say? By the time we reached my place, both of our phones buzzed back to life at the same time. His lit up with a bunch of missed notifications. Mine jumped from black screen straight to the lock screen with the same 70% battery it had before. No restart, no delay, just suddenly working again. We didn't talk much when we split off. He lived another 2 blocks over, but he didn't want me walking with him. I think he just wanted it to be over. Inside my room, I plugged in my phone and sat by the window, watching the street for a long time. Nothing else happened. The night looked like any other, but I still think about those shadows, pulling in opposite directions under an empty sky. It wasn't headlights, it wasn't moonlight. It was something above us, and we couldn't see it. I was out on County Route 14 running the plow. This was back in February, after one of those heavy lake effect bands that just sat over us for hours. The kind of snow that buries stop signs and makes the radio chatter non-stop with fender benders and people sliding off the road. I'd drawn the overnight shift, which wasn't unusual for me. I didn't mind it most of the time. Quiet roads, no traffic, just the hum of the truck and the glow of the headlights. It was about 3 in the morning. Temperature was hovering just below 0, and the wind had eased up a little after midnight, so it was mostly that thick, steady snow falling straight down. The cab of the plow was warm, the radio on low, and I'd settled into that rhythm of pushing snow, backing up, straightening out. You kind of zone out after a while. There's a stretch of 14 that runs flat through open farmland. No houses, no lights, nothing for a couple miles except utility poles and empty fields under the snow. I was halfway down it when I noticed something strange up ahead in the headlights. The snow wasn't falling the same way. Instead of drifting down in front of the truck, the flakes were twisting, like they'd gotten caught in a little whirlwind. At first, I figured it was just the wind funneling across the fields. That happens sometimes. You'll get a sudden gust, and the snow will spin in little eddies. But this wasn't moving across the road. It was locked in place, right in the center of my lane, maybe 30 yards ahead. A tight column, the flakes swirling upward instead of sideways. I slowed the plow down, the blades scraping loud against the pavement. The column didn't break apart like it should have. It stayed there, perfectly shaped, maybe 6 or 7 feet across. It looked like the air itself was turning in a spiral. I eased closer, keeping the truck steady. My first thought was, maybe there was a busted gas line venting or some kind of heat updraft. But the snow was being pulled up, not pushed aside. I rolled to a stop maybe 10 feet from it, let the engine idle. The cab lights glowed on the dashboard, but outside it was just the headlights on the storm. I leaned forward, squinting. The flakes climbed in a tight coil, like smoke from a chimney, but they weren't drifting away. They just disappeared as they went higher, like they'd been sucked into something I couldn't see. I tilted my head back and looked up through the windshield. That's when I saw it. Above the road, blotting out a patch of the sky, was a shape. Faint, almost transparent, but there. A disc, wide enough that it stretched across both lanes and into the fields. It wasn't lit up, not glowing, nothing like that. Just a darker patch against the stars, like holding a piece of frosted glass overhead. The snow swirled up into it and vanished. I killed the radio without even thinking, just so I could listen. The truck idled heavy, the heater fan buzzing, but outside, silence. No wind, no hum, no sound at all except the snow hitting the hood. I sat there, both hands on the wheel, staring up. I tried to tell myself it was a low cloud, or maybe my windshield had iced in a weird way. But the longer I looked, the more sure I was that something solid was hanging there. The stars around the edges were clear, sharp, but the middle was just gone. The column of snow suddenly shifted. It stretched wider, the flakes whipping faster, like a funnel opening up. The plow rocked slightly, like pressure dropped around it, and I swear I felt my ears pop. I reached for the gear shift, thinking maybe I should just back away. That was when the truck's headlights flickered. Not a full blackout, just a dip, like a brownout in a house. They dimmed, then flared back bright. At the same time, the dash clock reset itself. The cab got colder, too. I could see my breath, even though the heater was still blasting. The windshield fogged around the edges. I shifted into reverse, keeping my eyes on the column. The truck lurched backward, tires crunching over the packed snow. The second I moved, the swirl broke apart. The flakes scattered, falling normally again, like nothing had happened. I kept rolling until I was 50 yards back. My headlights caught only the falling snow now, nothing unusual. I craned my neck up, but the patch in the stars was fading, dissolving into the storm until I couldn't pick it out anymore. I sat there a long time, engine running, watching the snow fall straight again. Nothing moved overhead, no sound, no sign. Just the empty road and the fields buried under white. Eventually, I put it back in drive and eased forward. My hands were shaking, but the plow kept cutting a clean path. The spot where it had been was just another patch of snow-covered pavement. If I hadn't stopped, I might have convinced myself I imagined it. I finished the route, but I don't think I touched the radio again that night. Every time I looked up through the windshield, I caught myself searching for another shadow. When I parked the truck back at the garage around dawn, I didn't say anything to the others. Just hung up my jacket, signed the log, and went home. But I keep thinking about how the snow went up, not down. I was hanging laundry in the backyard just before dark. It was late June, one of those humid evenings where the air feels heavy and sticks to your skin. The cicadas were already buzzing in the trees, and the neighbor's dog barked every couple of minutes at nothing in particular. I'd been running late all day and didn't get the clothes in the washer until late afternoon, so I was trying to get them out before the sun was completely gone. We don't have a dryer. It's just me and my daughter, and I've always used the clothesline. 2 long ropes stretched across the yard from the back fence to a pole sunk in the ground near the shed. I was pinning up towels and shirts, moving slow because it was hot, when I noticed the first odd thing: the clothespins. I'd clipped a damp t-shirt to the line and stepped back to grab another, and when I looked again, the pins were shaking. Not falling off, not bouncing from the fabric shifting. Every single one on the line was trembling in place. It was a quick vibration, like the kind you'd see if someone plucked a guitar string. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the air was dead still. No breeze, not even the leaves overhead moving. I stood there, holding another shirt, staring at the line. The pins rattled against the rope, a faint wooden clicking sound. I glanced at my hands, wondering if maybe I was imagining it, but no. The movement was real. I set the shirt over my arm and looked around the yard. Everything else was normal. The grass, the trees, the fences, all perfectly still. The dog next door had gone quiet. Then the sound cut out. The pins stopped vibrating all at once, like somebody flipped a switch. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, clipped the shirt onto the line, and forced myself to keep going. My stomach felt tight, though. I kept glancing at the pins, waiting for them to start again. They did. I was reaching into the basket for a towel when the whole line gave a little quiver and every pin on it started buzzing again. This time the vibration was stronger, enough that the shirts rippled and flapped, even though the air around me stayed dead calm. I dropped the towel back into the basket and looked straight down the length of the rope, trying to see what was making it shake. That's when I felt it. A kind of pressure, not on my skin exactly, but in the air around me, like the weight you feel in your ears before a storm rolls in, except sharper, closer. I tilted my head back. Above the yard, barely higher than the tops of the maple trees, something drifted across the sky. It wasn't lit up like a spotlight or anything. It was faint, almost see-through, but glowing just enough that it stood out against the dusky sky. A shape, wide and rounded, moving slow and steady without a sound. The glow wasn't even. It was patchy, like pale light behind thin cloth. The edges blurred into the sky, but the middle had weight to it. Not clouds, not mist. I knew it was solid. It blocked the first stars coming out. I couldn't move. My hands stayed locked around the rim of the laundry basket, my knuckles slick with sweat. I just stared as the thing slid over my yard, silent, deliberate. The clothespins buzzed harder, some of them snapping open, and shirts slipping partly free and drooping toward the grass. The air pressed down on me, heavy enough that my chest hurt when I tried to breathe. My ears popped, like when you're in an airplane. It drifted directly overhead, slow enough that I could track every inch. From one end of the yard to the other took maybe half a minute, though it felt much longer. I tried to convince myself it was a plane or maybe a blimp, but there was no engine sound, no blinking lights. Just that dim, uneven glow. The dog next door let out one sharp bark, then went quiet again. When the shape reached the far end of the yard, the clothespins stopped. Just like before, all at once, silent. The air pressure eased, my ears cleared, and I could breathe normally again. The glow faded into the darkness beyond the trees, blending into the horizon until I couldn't pick it out anymore. I stood there frozen, basket still at my feet. A couple of shirts were half hanging, that half fallen. I didn't pick them up right away. I just stood in the yard, listening. The cicadas hadn't started again. Everything was too quiet. After a few minutes, I forced myself to finish hanging the clothes. My hands shook so badly I kept dropping pins. I hurried through it, barely straightening anything, just clipping them on wherever they'd hold. The air felt normal again, but I kept looking up, afraid I'd see it sliding back across the yard. When I finally went inside, I locked the back door and pulled the blinds. My daughter was asleep on the couch, TV still playing low. I didn't wake her. I sat in the chair across from her and listened for any sound outside. Nothing. In the morning, when I went out to bring the clothes in, a few pins were missing. The shirts were still there, drooping off the line, but the pins themselves weren't in the grass. I looked around for a while, expecting to find them near the fence or under the basket, but they weren't anywhere. I didn't hang laundry outside again for the rest of the summer. I was hiking alone up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire that October. The day had started crisp and clear, but by late afternoon, fog had started rolling in, low and thick, curling around the trees and making the trails feel smaller, tighter. I usually liked hiking alone, but that day the forest felt unusually quiet. No birds, no squirrels rustling, just the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional snap of a twig. I had been following a side trail off the main loop, trying to reach a small overlook I'd read about in a guidebook. The path was narrow and steep in places, rocks slick with fallen leaves. I paused on a flat stretch to check my compass. I always carry one, even though I know the trails fairly well. That's when I noticed it acting weird. The needle was spinning, fast and jerky, like the magnet inside had gone crazy. I held it steady in my hand, thinking maybe I'd bumped it against the metal buckle on my pack. I moved away from the pack, away from any obvious metal, and it kept spinning, full circles, over and over, like it had no center, no north. I shook it lightly, thinking it was broken, but it kept spinning, ignoring the way I held it. I set it down on a rock and watched it. The fog pressed in closer, and the forest seemed darker, all of a sudden, even though it was only a couple hours from sunset. I started walking again, trying to put some distance between me and whatever had made the compass freak out, but the needle kept moving erratically whenever I checked it. That's when I saw it. It started low in the trees, maybe 20 feet off the trail, a dim glow that didn't look like sunlight, and it wasn't red or orange like a lantern. Just a soft, pale light that shifted and hovered in place. I froze. My boots had stopped crunching leaves, my breath caught somewhere in my chest. The light didn't flicker like a fire or shine like a flashlight, it just glowed. A subtle, steady illumination, like a pearl suspended in air. I blinked and it seemed to rise slowly, smoothly, silently, without brushing any branches or scattering leaves. The fog bent around it the way air does when there's heat, but this didn't feel warm. It didn't feel anything except heavy, like the quiet in the forest had been amplified, like the sound had been sucked out. I started moving backward a little, trying not to make a sound, and it floated upward, drifting between the trunks, higher and higher. I kept my eyes on it as it passed the tallest maples, rising above the fog. I thought maybe it would stop at the canopy or vanish behind a ridge, but it didn't. It just went straight up, slow and deliberate, until it disappeared into the low clouds overhead. No flare, no bright pulse, just gone. I stood there, still gripping my backpack straps, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The compass had stopped spinning, but I didn't trust it. I turned it over in my hand. North pointed a consistent direction now, but my stomach was still tight, and I felt like I'd been holding my breath for a long time. I kept walking down the trail, trying to act normal, but my pace was uneven. Every shadow felt like it might move. Every tree looked like it could hide something. I thought about calling someone, my brother maybe, but my phone barely had signal. And who would believe this? I didn't even know what this was. The fog stayed low, crawling across roots and rocks, and I started noticing other small things. A branch that had snapped weeks ago looked freshly broken. Leaves piled in corners of the trail seemed pressed down, flattened, not scattered naturally. A deer ran off into the underbrush, then froze and looked back at me, unnervingly still, then bounded away again. Eventually, I reached a wider section of the trail that opened onto a small ridge. The sun was almost down, weak orange light trying to filter through the fog, and I could see the valley stretching below me. I stopped there, leaning on my knees, shaking my head. The forest looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. I checked my compass one last time. North was steady. I turned it in my hands, spun it slowly, and it didn't move. I put it back in my pocket. I made my way back to the trailhead faster than I normally would, jumping over roots and slipping on wet leaves, not looking back, just focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The fog started to lift as I dropped lower in elevation, and I could hear distant traffic and the occasional barking dog in the distance. Normal sounds. When I reached my car, I leaned against the door for a moment, catching my breath, trying to tell myself I had imagined it. I hadn't touched the compass since then, just shoved it back in my pack. I didn't hang around the parking area. I drove straight home, keeping the windows up even though it was cool, watching the trees recede in the headlights. At home, I unpacked the pack and set the compass on the kitchen counter. I looked at it, expecting it to spin again or jitter, but it didn't. Just sat there, quiet, normal, pointing north like nothing had happened. I kept thinking about that glow over the trees, how smooth it was, the way it ignored branches, the silence. And I kept thinking about that compass, spinning like it had been freed from reality for a few minutes. I haven't hiked that trail alone since. I still have the compass in my drawer. Sometimes I take it out, turn it in my hand, and watch it, half expecting it to spin again, and I wonder if it ever will. I was flying a small Cessna 172 over northern Minnesota that late afternoon, doing a short cross-country hop from Brainerd to Duluth. The sky was mostly clear, the kind of crisp September day where the air feels thin and everything looks sharper than it really is. I like flying alone. It's quiet, steady, and predictable, and after a long week teaching at the local flight school, I was looking forward to nothing more than a couple hours above the trees and lakes. I just passed the Mississippi River's bend near Aitkin and leveled out at 5,000 feet. The wind was calm, the plane humming smoothly, and I was watching the landscape roll beneath me. Fields turning gold, lakes reflecting the low sun, scattered clouds casting shadows that slid across the hills. I had the radio on, scanning for other traffic, but the frequency was quiet. I remember first noticing it out of the corner of my eye. A tiny flicker of light at my 6 o'clock, maybe a mile behind, off to the left. At first, I thought it was a reflection off the wing, the kind you get when the sun hits the struts at just the right angle. I shifted slightly in my seat and glanced over, and it was gone. Then it appeared again, this time clearly visible, just off the left wing. Small, glowing, spherical, maybe the size of a basketball from my distance. The glow wasn't intense, just a pale yellow-white like a street lamp shrouded in fog. I watched it, thinking some hobbyist drone had gotten too close, but it didn't behave like anything I've ever flown near. It didn't drift with the wind, it didn't jitter or wobble from turbulence. It stayed perfectly level, pacing alongside me. I eased the throttle back, lowering my airspeed from 120 knots to maybe 100. The orb matched me knot for knot, keeping its relative position off the wing. I banked slightly left, and it mirrored me perfectly, drifting across the sky as if it were in a synchronized dance. My first instinct was to radio ATC, but I hesitated. I wasn't sure what I'd even say. Ah, there's a glowing ball floating next to my plane. It didn't feel dangerous exactly, just impossible. And it was silent. No hum, no engine, nothing that would normally come with a helicopter, drone, or even a distant light reflecting off a cloud. I tried to focus on flying, keeping the plane steady, but my eyes kept snapping back to it. The orb stayed just off the wingtip, maybe 100 feet away, gliding as smoothly as the plane. I tapped the yoke, adjusted altitude slightly, and it did the same. Not like a mechanical drone responding to my movements, more like it was aware of them, anticipating. I glanced down at the altimeter and airspeed. Everything was normal. The plane wasn't acting weird, the controls were smooth. But my brain kept going back to that orb. My stomach tightened, a low kind of dread that I couldn't place. I reached for my phone, thinking I could take a picture through the window, but the glare from the sun made the screen useless. For several minutes, I kept flying like that, adjusting, testing, moving slightly in altitude, and the orb stayed with me. I started timing it in my head. 4 minutes, 5 minutes, maybe more. It kept pace with me the whole way. At one point, a thin cloud bank appeared ahead, scattered and low. The orb didn't slow down or deviate. It drifted right into the cloud, and for a moment I thought maybe that was the end of it. But then I watched as the cloud swallowed it, and within a few seconds, it was gone. No trail, no flicker, nothing. Just gone. I circled back a little, thinking maybe I'd missed it behind the plane, scanning above and below. Nothing. The sky was empty, the only sound the hum of the engine and the wind past the wings. I flew the rest of the route in silence, more alert than usual, eyes darting to every shadow and cloud. I kept checking my instruments compulsively, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe a weather balloon caught in sunlight, maybe a reflection I couldn't explain. But nothing made sense. Weather balloons drift slowly. They can't match an aircraft in midair. And reflections wouldn't mirror my movements. Not exactly. Landing at Duluth was uneventful. The airport was quiet. I taxied to the hangar, shut down the engine, and sat there for a long time with my hands on the yoke. My skin was tight, chest heavy. I felt watched, but I was alone. I didn't mention it to anyone at the flight school, not at first. I figured people would laugh or chalk it up to fatigue or tricks of the light, but I replayed it in my head for days. Every maneuver, every second it stayed with me, pacing me like it knew exactly where I'd be. A week later, I talked to a buddy who flies ultralights in that area. He said he'd seen weird lights out over the lake sometimes, things that hover or move against the wind, but nobody knew what they were. They vanish before you get close. That was it. No explanation, just acknowledgement that other pilots had glimpsed something similar. I've flown that route a dozen times since. Clear skies, same altitude, same time of day. Nothing, just the engine, the hum of the plane, the passing trees and lakes. But every time I climb into the cockpit, I glance at the left wing, expecting to see that pale orb floating there, pacing me again, silent and deliberate, before vanishing into nothing. I pulled into the I-90 rest stop around 1:30 a.m., tired after a long day driving freight from Chicago to Spokane. I wasn't supposed to stop yet, but the hours had been stacking up and my eyelids felt like sandpaper. The lot was mostly empty, just a handful of trucks parked along the far edges. I found a corner, cut the engine, and collapsed into the driver's seat of my own rig. The night was cold, a damp wind making the air smell faintly of wet asphalt and pine from the trees bordering the lot. I slept lightly, the kind of dozing where you wake up every half hour to check the clock or hear the tires crunching on the gravel outside. I was somewhere in that half-conscious state when I felt it, a kind of prickle on my skin, like the air had thickened, like the lot itself was holding its breath. I cracked my eyes open, expecting maybe a flashlight from a passing cop or another driver coming in late. That's when I saw it. Every vehicle in the rest area was lit from above by a pale light. Not headlights, not the yellow glow from the street lamps. This was something different. Soft, almost silvery, and it moved. It drifted across the tops of the trucks, sliding along like a ghost brushing over their roofs. Every rig, every car, even the cars parked closest to the highway, had this same glow moving across it. It wasn't flickering or pulsing, just steady, fluid, like it was brushing against the world itself. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was still dreaming or imagining things in the low light. When I opened them again, the light had shifted. It wasn't in the same spots, but the movement was consistent, sweeping across every vehicle, slow and deliberate. I tried to peer out the windshield, making sure I wasn't seeing reflections from my dash lights, my own rig, anything I could rationalize. But the glow was out there in the lot, independent of me, independent of the lamps overhead. I grabbed my flashlight from the console and switched it on, just a narrow beam, thinking maybe I could track it better. The moment I flicked it on, the glow moved faster across the cars, but never in any way that suggested it had a source. No shadows, no highlights, no angles. It didn't bounce or reflect, it just flowed. I got out of the cab, my boots crunching the frost-coated asphalt, and froze. Every step I took didn't seem to disturb the glow at all. I waved my hand, half expecting it to scatter, but it didn't. It shifted, brushing past the vehicles in a way that was smooth, precise, like it knew the contours of every hood, every windshield, every wheel. The wind whispered through the lot, making the antennae on my truck vibrate, but the air didn't feel cold where the light passed. It didn't feel like heat either. It felt nothing, just presence, and it made the lot feel empty, vast, even though I was surrounded by parked vehicles. I stayed still for a long time, trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at. I thought maybe it was one of those fancy drones someone might be testing. No, too quiet, too smooth, and the pattern made no sense. Not like a drone flight path. Not like any tech I knew. Then I blinked. The light was gone. Every last vehicle, every space between them, even the far edge of the lot, was black. Street lamps above flickered dimly, but the lot itself was completely dark. I squinted, scanning for any hint of movement. Nothing. No glow, no reflection, nothing. I swore I could still feel it, though, that same pressure I felt when I first woke, like the lot had contracted and then vanished, leaving me exposed. My breath came faster. I checked the clock. No more than a few seconds had passed. It felt longer. I backed up to the cab and climbed in, closing the door slowly, carefully. My hands were shaking as I reached for the ignition. I didn't want to drive yet. Didn't want to put distance between me and whatever I'd just seen, but I also didn't want to stay. The truck started with a hum, the heater kicking in, and I kept looking out the windshield, trying to see if it would reappear. Nothing. I drove slowly around the perimeter of the lot, thinking maybe I'd missed a trick of the light, a reflection off the highway, headlights I hadn't noticed. But the lot remained completely dark. The few other trucks parked where I'd seen them, untouched, ordinary. The air smelled the same, cold, wet, and piney. Nothing else happened. By the time I left the rest stop and got back on the highway, my mind was still spinning. I tried to rationalize it. Could it have been fog catching the moonlight in a weird way? No, the sky had been overcast, moon hidden, maybe some electrical phenomenon. I've driven through thunderstorms, ice storms, weird static before, but this was different. Completely different. There was no storm, no crackling, nothing like it. I made it to my motel a few hours later, still jittery, still looking over my shoulder at the empty lots of other trucks. I couldn't stop thinking about the glow, the way it moved, brushing over the tops of everything like it was observing or mapping or just present. I didn't tell anyone. Not dispatch, not my buddies at the yard. Who would believe me? I didn't even take a picture. I was too nervous to move when I first saw it. I'm not proud of that, but it felt like if I even blinked wrong, I might miss it, and then it would vanish. The next week, I tried parking at other rest stops along my routes, late at night, hoping I was imagining it, or that it had been some weird trick of that one place. Nothing happened anywhere else. Just normal asphalt, lamps, trucks, and empty air. But I can't shake that night. Every time I park somewhere to sleep, I glance around, waiting for that pale, moving light to slide across the tops of the trucks like it did before. Silent, deliberate, brushing everything in sight, only to blink and see nothing. I've stopped sleeping in that rest stop now. We got to the campsite just as the sun was dipping behind the ridge. There were 4 of us, me, my brother Mark, his friend Lisa, and my buddy Jordan. The trailhead was nearly empty. which was fine. We'd all been itching for a quiet weekend in the mountains without anyone else around. We set up in a small clearing just off the main path, enough space for the tents and a fire ring that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The air was dry, the sort that scratches at your throat when you take a deep breath. Once the tents were up, Mark and Jordan started gathering firewood while Lisa and I unpacked our gear. The forest was quiet in that typical late summer way. Occasional birds, a breeze stirring the needles, distant water from the stream down the hill. Nothing unusual. We got the fire going around 8 p.m., just as the last of the light faded. The flames were small at first, flickering over logs that had been sitting in the sun all day, warm and dry. We were talking about the hike earlier, joking about the old ranger station that's supposedly haunted, when I noticed something off about the fire. The shadows it cast didn't stay close to the ground. I blinked, thinking I was seeing things. The darkness around the fire seemed to stretch upward, like the flames were pulling the shadows along the trees, not just across the clearing. "Do you guys see that?" I asked, squinting. "What?" Mark said, tossing another log on the fire. "The shadows, they're moving wrong," I said, "like they're climbing the trees or something." Lisa leaned forward. "You mean just flickering?" "No," I said. "They're going up, not sideways, not from the fire's angle, straight up, like they're being pulled." Jordan laughed, though it didn't sound right. "You're seeing things, man. Firelight does weird stuff in the dark." I thought that too at first, but then the air felt heavier, like the night had compressed around us. The breeze stopped, even though the trees were still moving slightly in the wind a few hundred feet away. The forest was quiet in a way that made my skin itch. And then we saw it. A faint light, pale and diffuse, moving above us. Not a flashlight or a lantern, nothing that could be coming from the ground. It drifted silently over the clearing, over our heads, just above the trees. The glow was subtle, the kind you notice more out of the corner of your eye at first, then suddenly can't ignore. Lisa whispered, "Is that?" I nodded. "I think so." It moved slowly, hovering just above the tallest pines. The shadows from the fire stretched higher, almost like they were leaning toward it. There was no sound, no hum, no wind, nothing, but the presence of it made the air feel thicker. My chest tightened without realizing it. We all stayed frozen for a few minutes, just watching. Mark kept his hands on his knees, leaning forward. Jordan's jaw was tight, and Lisa's eyes were wide, unblinking. The light drifted in a smooth path, not a random float like a drone or a bird, more like it knew the contours of the trees, the space of our clearing, and was moving deliberately through it. I tried to rationalize. Maybe some scientific study, someone testing something in the forest? But it didn't make sense. The nearest road was miles away. No one was supposed to be in the woods at this hour. No traffic, no planes, nothing that could account for a light moving so slowly, so steadily, overhead. The fire shifted a little, logs cracking, and the shadows rippled. The shadows didn't just sway, they seemed to rise, stretching toward the canopy as if the light above was pulling them upward. I stared at them, feeling a strange vertigo, like the ground beneath the fire was tilting even though the rest of the clearing stayed level. Then, the glow passed directly overhead, pale, silent, stretching across the small clearing before moving toward the ridge in the distance. It was barely brighter than moonlight, but it illuminated the edges of the nearest branches, the tips of the needles, and for a moment, everything looked almost like it wasn't part of this world. And then it was gone. No hum, no residual light, no shift in the air. Just normal dark, the fire flickering normally, shadows back on the ground as they should be. The breeze returned, gentle and ordinary. The forest smelled the same as it had when we arrived. The clearing seemed exactly as it had always been. We sat there in silence for a while, listening to the normal sounds of the night. Crickets, the distant stream, the occasional rustle of leaves. Nothing else moved. Nothing else glowed. I felt my chest unclench slowly, but I was still tense, still staring at the trees where the light had disappeared. Eventually, Jordan spoke. "Okay, well, I guess that happened." Mark laughed nervously. "Yeah, totally normal." Lisa shook her head. "That wasn't normal. You saw it too, right?" I nodded. Everyone saw it. We didn't talk about it much after that. We finished our dinner, packed away some of the firewood, and tried to act normal. None of us could sleep right away. Every crack of a branch, every shadow in the trees made us tense. In the morning, everything looked ordinary. The clearing was quiet, the fire pit cold, the shadows normal. There was no sign that anything unusual had happened. We packed up, hiked back to the trailhead, and drove down the forest road toward town. Even now, I think about that light and the way the shadows bent toward it. I've been back to that area during the day, and it looks like any other patch of forest. But the memory of that pale glow drifting over the trees, silent and deliberate, and the shadows stretching up toward it, stays with me. Sometimes when I'm back in my own yard at dusk, I catch the shadows flickering oddly in the light of the street lamps and think about that night. I know it was real, or at least, it felt real. And part of me expects that glow to appear again, just for a moment, drifting through the trees and making everything in its path feel off. I was on my third night shift at the Granger Industries plant in western Pennsylvania. The kind of job where you get used to the machines humming constantly, the smell of heated metal, and the fluorescent lights casting everything in the same dull gray. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and I mostly monitored the assembly lines, checked gauges, logged readings, that sort of thing. It was boring in the best way, predictable, except for the occasional spark or misfeed. Nothing ever really happened. I was walking from the loading bay to the maintenance office around 2:15 a.m., flashlight in hand, when I noticed a subtle change in the night sky over the factory. Normally, all I'd see were the usual sodium street lamps glowing weakly over the parking lot, or the distant lights from the highway. But there was something different tonight. A cluster of lights, high above the main building, arranged in a rough triangle. At first, I thought it was some kind of aircraft, maybe a helicopter hovering over the plant, but the lights weren't blinking in the pattern you'd expect. They were steady, almost too steady, and the formation didn't drift or sway. I stopped walking and squinted up at them. I whispered, "That's weird." I didn't expect anyone to hear me. The plant was mostly empty at this hour, just me and a handful of other night shift workers, spread out across the floor. I debated calling maintenance or security, thinking maybe there was some crane or work light I hadn't noticed, but I shook my head. It was too high up, and nothing on the roof was tall enough to line up with these lights. I kept watching. The triangle stayed in place for several minutes. I could see faintly the edges of the factory roof beneath it, rows of empty cars in the lot and the shadowed outlines of storage containers, but the lights above seemed almost out of place, like they were hovering in a different layer of the night sky. I raised my hand, trying to block the glare of the nearby floodlights to get a clearer view. Still, the lights stayed perfectly still. My stomach tightened, not with fear exactly, more with that unease you get when something defies explanation. I glanced around the yard, half expecting to see someone else staring up, but the night was empty. The only sounds were the distant hum of machinery, the occasional clang of a shutter, and the far-off rumble of trucks on the highway. I thought about taking a picture, but my phone was in the locker, charging. By the time I decided it was worth it, I didn't want to move. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The triangle of lights seemed to pulse faintly, or maybe that was my mind trying to make sense of them. There was no sound, no movement, just that impossible stillness. Then something strange happened. I blinked, literally blinked. Not in disbelief, just a normal blink. When I opened my eyes, the lights were gone. Not dimmed, not faded, just gone. The sky looked the same as always. Clouds scattered, stars peeking out, nothing unusual. My stomach dropped, and I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. I stared for several more minutes, scanning every angle. No trace, no reflection, nothing. Even the spot where the triangle had been looked normal. Empty sky. I walked toward the office, trying to shake it off. My hands were a little clammy, and the flashlight felt heavier than it should have. The hum of the machines was louder than usual, almost like it had picked up a resonance with the tight knot of tension in my chest. Inside, I tried to act normal. Logged the readings, jotted notes about the machinery, but I kept glancing out the windows. The lot was empty, the only lights those dim sodium lamps. Nothing else in the sky. When the morning shift started arriving, I didn't mention it. Who would believe me? Oh yeah, I saw some weird lights forming a triangle over the plant. I could hear people laughing already. The rational part of me tried to chalk it up to reflections, some new aerial survey, or a trick of the clouds catching the streetlights. But nothing matched what I'd seen. Over the next few nights, I watched the sky from the same spot on the yard, near the loading bay. I never saw the triangle again. Jets, helicopters, satellites, and planes all passed normally, blinking or streaking as expected. No hovering lights, no perfect triangles, nothing that matched the impossible stillness I'd witnessed. I kept thinking about the way they'd held their position, hovering just over the roof, completely silent, almost deliberate. The longer I tried to make sense of it, the more unsettled I felt, like the whole night had been stretched and compressed at the same time. Weeks later, I mentioned it to Mark, a friend from the day shift who's been working here for a decade. He laughed at first, then frowned. "I've seen weird lights over the plant before," he said, quietly. "Never anything like a triangle, always moving, drifting. But yeah, sometimes it's just there, for no reason." That didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made the memory stick even more. I still find myself scanning the sky from the parking lot when I finish late at night. Watching, waiting, thinking I might see that triangle again, hovering silently above the roof like it did that first time. I've never had an answer. No one else reported it. No cameras caught it. Just me, the night, and that impossible stationary triangle. And even now, when I close my eyes, I can picture it perfectly. The three pale lights, steady and precise, just above the factory, holding still for those few minutes before they blinked out all at once. We were sitting down to dinner around 7 that Friday night. My wife, Kara, had made spaghetti, and our son, Ben, was fiddling with his fork like he always does. The house was quiet in that suburban way it gets once the sun dips behind the roof lines and everyone's home from work or school. I remember thinking how ordinary everything felt, that comfortable kind of routine. Then the thumping started. It wasn't subtle. It was a steady, heavy thump coming from somewhere above us. Not the creak of the roof settling, not the neighbor's kid running around. It had a rhythm, like someone bouncing a ball, low and muffled but unmistakable. I froze mid-bite. Kara looked up, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Ben laughed at first, thinking it was part of a game. "It's probably just a branch," I said, though I didn't sound convinced. The thumping didn't stop. I got up, wiping my hands on a napkin, and moved toward the back door. Each step made the sound seem louder, closer, though I could see nothing from the window. The backyard was fenced in, and there were a couple of big maples and oaks. Wind had been minimal all day, so no branches should be hitting the roof. I stepped out, Kara following, and Ben trailing reluctantly. The air was warm, sticky from a late summer heat wave, the kind that makes you notice every drop of sweat on your arms. I strained to hear. Nothing. Not a thump. Not even a creak, just the quiet hum of cicadas somewhere near the fence. I frowned and looked up. That's when I noticed it. A glow, faint, pale, almost misty, lingering in the clouds above the house. Not like streetlights or porch lights reflecting off the low clouds, and not orange or red, more like the sort of grayish-white light that softens edges. It hovered just off the peak of our roof, high enough to be above the trees, but low enough that it seemed wrong. "What is that?" Kara whispered, stepping closer to me. "I don't know," I said. My voice sounded tight even to me. We stayed there for a minute. Ben pointed. "It's like the moon," he said. I looked at him and shook my head. The moon wasn't in the sky tonight, not visible behind the clouds. This wasn't a reflection, wasn't any normal light I'd ever seen in a suburban backyard. I considered the roof again. The thumping had stopped the second we came outside. I glanced at the shingles, squinting. Nothing. No footprints, no debris, no limbs of a tree brushing it. Kara suggested we go around front to see if maybe the neighbors had their porch lights on or some event going on. We walked carefully down the driveway, eyes scanning the sky. The glow shifted slightly, like it was moving in place, not floating away, but drifting just enough to change perspective. The edges weren't sharp, and it wasn't casting light on anything below. You could barely tell it was there if you didn't look directly. Ben tugged at my shirt. "It's moving," he said. I watched, trying to track it. It wasn't moving in any pattern I could identify. Not like a drone, not like a plane. No blinking lights, no noise. Just the soft, consistent glow, hovering. I reached for my phone to take a picture, but the battery had died. Of course. I thought about going inside for the charger, but I didn't want to lose sight of it. The glow lingered maybe 5 minutes. Long enough that my brain started trying to find an explanation. Any explanation. Streetlights? No. Plane? No sound. Balloon? No reflection. Whatever it was, it didn't behave like anything ordinary. Finally, it dissipated. Not quickly, but like it faded into the clouds, as if the color washed out and the light merged with the sky. I blinked, and it was gone. We went back inside, trying to laugh it off. Kara said it was probably an optical illusion, clouds reflecting something we didn't see. I agreed half-heartedly. Ben was already back to his fork, no longer curious. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the glow hovering above the roof, watching from the clouds. In the morning, everything looked normal. The shingles were dry, no footprints, no marks. The yard exactly how we'd left it. Even the trees seemed ordinary again. We talked about it a little at breakfast, trying to pin it down. I checked local news, scrolled community forums. Nothing unusual reported. No storm, no event, no missing satellites. Just the normal suburban quiet. But I kept looking up every time I went outside over the next week. I've driven past the house since, checked the sky, peeked at the roof from the street. Nothing. Nothing to explain the thumping or the glow. The world went back to normal, as if it had never happened. But I can't stop thinking about it. Even now, months later, I catch myself glancing at the clouds at dusk, half expecting to see that same pale hovering light lingering in place, silent and patient, above the shingles of our suburban house. I pulled my rig up the dirt track just past the last mile marker, the one where the trees start crowding the road so tightly that you can't see any sky unless you're right at the clearing. I was delivering a small package to a rental cabin out in the hills. Nothing unusual, just a routine drop. I remember the night being humid for October, the kind of sticky that makes your shirt cling while you're steering a big van over uneven ground. Mist hung in the hollows between the trees, catching the beams of my headlights in thin, ghostly veils. The cabin appeared almost out of nowhere, tucked into a curve in the ridge. Its lights were on, warm and steady. A porch light, a lamp by the side door, a single upstairs window glowing amber. I parked and killed the engine, the sudden silence in the forest making me aware of every rustle and distant drip of water. I grabbed the package, careful to watch for roots and rocks in the dark. The first weird thing happened as I stepped out of the cab. Every exterior light on the cabin flickered, the porch bulb dimming and brightening 3 times in unison. The upstairs window light wavered too, like someone had quickly adjusted the dimmer. I froze, mid-step, thinking maybe it was the power line running up the hill, a surge or dip. But the lines looked fine. No sparks, no snapping. The flicker lasted barely 2 seconds, and then everything steadied, the lights returning to normal like nothing had happened. My hands were still on the package, and for a second I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I set the package down on the porch railing and tried to brush off the feeling, telling myself the lights had just tripped. I glanced up at the treetops because that's what you do when a weird thought hits you. You look where the light comes from. That's when I saw it, a pale glow drifting across the clearing above the cabin. It wasn't bright like a streetlight or a headlamp. It was subtle, diffuse, almost watery, moving slowly against the backdrop of black sky. It had no sound. My first instinct was to squint, to think my eyes were playing tricks with the mist, but the shape moved deliberately, like it had purpose. I held my breath and watched it float toward the ridge opposite the cabin. The mist refracted it just slightly, edges soft, almost like it wasn't fully there. It moved slower than anything I've ever seen in the air at night. No wings, no engines, no blinking navigation lights, just a smooth drift. I glanced back at the cabin to make sure the lights hadn't gone out again. They were solid, steady, everything normal. Nothing to suggest anyone else was outside or inside. My dog, Milo, who had been curled in the passenger seat, lifted his head, ears flicking toward the glow, then barked softly, more curious than alarmed. I didn't make a sound. I just watched. The glow climbed a little higher, fading against the upper mist, and then slowly moved out of view toward the tree line. I stepped closer to the edge of the porch, trying to catch any hint of a source, any reflection or lens flare, anything that could explain it. There was nothing. I turned to the van to grab my phone, thinking maybe video, maybe a photo, anything, and I swear the cabin lights seemed to respond. The porch light twitched ever so slightly, a tiny pulse in the beam, then settled completely. The glow was gone by the time I lifted the phone, not a trace in the sky. I moved the camera, looked up again. Nothing. Just the mist and the still forest. I left the package on the railing, jingling the doorbell lightly so the renter would know it was there. My hands were shaking just enough to feel it in the way I gripped the handle. I stepped back, glanced at the tree line again, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe a distant helicopter with a weird light filter, but no rotor noise, no mechanical hum, no flashing lights. Maybe a plane, but again, it didn't move like an aircraft. Too slow, too controlled. I felt the air press in close, the smell of damp earth and pine needles sharp and grounding, and the glow became this memory overlaying the ordinary. I got back into the van and waited a moment before starting the engine, eyes scanning the treetops and the ridge opposite. The fog clung to the ground, making the lights from my headlights scatter into a shallow curtain. My reflection in the rearview mirror caught my own eyes, wide and pale in the dim cab light. Milo shifted in the passenger seat again, lying down, but alert. I told myself to breathe, that whatever it was had moved on, that I had a job to finish, and the next stop was 20 miles down a gravel road. Driving out, the cabin faded behind the trees, the porch light steady again, the glow nowhere. I replayed the moments over and over in my mind. The simultaneous flicker, the drifting pale light, the way it moved without wind, without sound. I tried telling myself I had just caught a weird electrical quirk or some atmospheric anomaly, but none of it sat right. By the time I hit the paved road again, the forest behind me seemed normal. No mist hung in the moonlight, just open sky, scattered clouds, and distant hills. The truck hummed beneath me, the package in the back secure, ordinary. But in my chest there was this tiny, stubborn awareness that I had seen something, and it hadn't been ordinary. When I finally got home, I put the keys down, checked the lights on my own house, all steady, all normal. Milo jumped off the seat and padded inside, unconcerned. I sat with a coffee, thinking about the night, about the cabin, about the glow drifting silently over the tree line. I couldn't explain it, not with physics or mechanics or weather. I didn't know what it was. But I saw it. And for that night at least, the world had felt slightly different, like a layer had lifted and revealed something beneath. I went to sleep with the sound of the ceiling fan running, the house lights steady, the world supposedly normal, but my mind kept replaying that pale drift across the sky, slow and silent, impossible and real all at once. It lingered there with me, quiet as the mist, leaving a mark I couldn't name and might never understand. I was fishing off the pier near Cedar Point that night. It wasn't much of a pier, more like a long stretch of old wood planks and rusted rails where the locals tie their boats, but I liked it because no one bothered me there. It was early September, the air still warm from the day, but with that cooler bite that meant fall was creeping in. The lake was calm, almost too calm. Usually at night you hear the water slapping against the pilings, or at least some ripples, but it looked flat as glass. I had my lantern set low on the boards, one of those old Coleman kerosene things. I don't trust headlamps when I fish at night. The lantern light only reached a few feet out, leaving most of the lake swallowed in darkness. I didn't mind. It was quiet, and I'd gotten used to that kind of silence. Around midnight, I noticed something out on the water. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe from a plane or a house light behind me. But it wasn't just one. 3 little glows were moving across the surface, spaced apart like they were in formation. They weren't white, more like a pale yellow with a faint green edge, the kind of light you'd get from a glow stick, but brighter, sharper. I set my rod down and leaned on the railing, squinting. The lights skimmed low, no higher than a foot above the water, and they didn't flicker. They just moved, steady and slow, gliding side by side. At one point, they curved toward each other like they were weaving, then spread back apart. My first thought was some kids had put drones out there, though the silence killed that idea pretty quick. You can always hear the buzzing, especially when it's that quiet. This was nothing, not even a ripple. I watched for a good couple minutes, my chest getting tight. It didn't feel right. I don't scare easy, but it was the kind of thing where your brain can't figure out what it's looking at. Finally, I reached down and grabbed the lantern, lifted it off the planks, and held it toward the lake to get a better look. The second the light hit them, all three stopped. They froze in place, hovering over the water. I swear they turned toward me. I know that doesn't make sense. Lights don't look at you, but that's what it felt like. Then, without warning, they rose. Not fast, not slow, just smooth. Straight up. The lantern glass rattled in my hand, though I don't know if that was from me shaking or something else. The three lights climbed higher until they were well above the tree line. For a second, they just hung there in a triangle shape, faint but sharp against the night sky. And then they were gone. No streak, no fade, just gone. I lowered the lantern and looked at the water. Perfectly still. No disturbance at all, like nothing had been there. If you dropped a stone into that lake, it would have made more of a mark than those lights did. I stayed frozen for a while, gripping the railing, staring out at nothing. I thought maybe they'd come back. The silence pressed down heavy. Even the bugs had stopped. Not a single cricket, just the hiss of the lantern. After maybe 10 minutes, I forced myself to pack up. My hands felt clumsy on the tackle box, like I couldn't get them to work right. I left half my bait sitting in the cooler because I couldn't focus enough to collect it all. The walk back to the car felt longer than usual. Every step I expected to see those lights again, floating out from between the trees or above the road. When I finally got to the lot, my truck interior light wouldn't come on. I sat in the dark for a minute before the dome flickered and came back. The radio didn't work on the drive home, just static. I didn't fish at night again for a long time after that. I was camping solo out in the Sonoran Desert when it happened. I'd been driving west from Tucson, looking for a quiet spot where I wouldn't see another person for days. I parked off a dirt road, hiked my pack in maybe a mile, and set up my tent on a flat patch of hardpan near some scrub. It was late spring, so the nights were cool, and the stars came out sharp and endless once the sun went down. That first night passed without anything unusual. Coyotes in the distance, the occasional hum of an insect, all the normal desert sounds. The second night was when things went wrong. I went to sleep early. My little two-man tent was pitched facing north, with the fly stake down but the vents open for air. I remember waking up sometime after midnight, though I couldn't say what made me stir. No noise, no wind, nothing that I could recall. But the inside of the tent didn't look right. The walls were glowing faintly, like a soft bluish light was being held just above the fabric. It wasn't bright enough to hurt my eyes, but it was steady, consistent. I blinked a few times, half convinced I was dreaming, but the glow didn't fade. At first, I thought maybe the moon had come out from behind clouds, except I knew it was a new moon that week, and this wasn't silvery like moonlight. It was duller, pale, almost clinical. I sat there for a minute, listening. The desert was dead quiet. Too quiet. Even the crickets had stopped. I unzipped the flap, hesitating with my hand on the zipper because part of me really didn't want to see what was outside. Still, curiosity won. I stuck my head out and looked up. Directly above my tent hovered an oval of pale light. It wasn't far, maybe 100 feet up, maybe less. The edges were fuzzy, not solid like a craft, but not formless either. It was shaped, deliberate. The glow was even and soft, no beams, no flickering, no noise. Just this oval hanging in the sky like it had been waiting for me to notice it. I stepped all the way out of the tent, barefoot on the cold ground, craning my neck. My heart was thudding so hard it almost drowned out the silence. The light didn't move at first. It just sat there, suspended. I had the oddest impression that it was looking back at me, though there was nothing to see but the glow. I thought about grabbing my phone from inside the tent to take a picture, but when I checked my pocket out of habit, it was dead. I'd charged it in the car earlier, so it should have had plenty of juice. I ducked back into the tent and tried it anyway. Black screen, no response. My lantern wouldn't turn on either. That's when I started shaking. I went back outside and looked up again. The oval finally shifted. It rose slowly like a balloon catching a current, but it wasn't drifting randomly. It climbed smooth and steady, no wobble, no sound, straight up into the night. The higher it went, the fainter it became, until it was just another dim star swallowed in the thousands above. The desert stayed silent for a long while after. I sat on the ground outside my tent, hugging my knees, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, the normal sounds trickled back in, the chirp of insects, the distant call of something moving through the scrub. I didn't go back to sleep for the rest of the night. When the sun came up, everything looked ordinary again. My phone turned back on like nothing had happened, full charge, working perfectly. The lantern worked too. No trace of the glow, no marks on the ground, no explanation. Just me and the sand and a gnawing unease I couldn't shake. I broke camp that morning and left earlier than I'd planned. I've camped alone plenty of times since, but I've never gone back to that stretch of desert. Even now, whenever I unzip a tent in the dark, I half expect to see that pale oval waiting overhead, silent and watching. It was a Thursday night run, late summer, middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. I was working for a regional courier company, mostly delivering auto parts to repair shops after hours. My route usually took me through a mix of back roads and small towns, quiet stretches where the only light came from my headlights and the occasional farmhouse porch. That night was uneventful until around 11. I just dropped off at a shop outside Millbrook and was cutting across Old Quarry Road to get to the next town. That's when I passed the house the first time. It was an old farmhouse, 2 stories, paint peeling on the siding, the kind of place you notice because it looks stuck in another decade. No lights on inside, no porch light, no yard light. The fields around it were dark too. I didn't think much of it. Half the houses along that road were empty or used as storage barns. I kept driving, following the GPS through turns I'd taken a dozen times before. But about 20 minutes later, after looping around the back roads, I came up to that same farmhouse again. I actually slowed down because it didn't make sense. My GPS showed I was on County Line Road, not Old Quarry. But there it was, the same tilted mailbox, same cracked driveway, same sagging porch swing. It was like I'd circled without realizing it, even though the route shouldn't have brought me back there. As I passed it the second time, something caught my eye. The roofline looked wrong. It wasn't brighter like a normal light inside turning on. It was more like the entire outline of the roof glowed faintly, as if something above it was casting a pale, even light straight down. It didn't flicker, didn't shift. Just this faint glow, barely strong enough to make out the shingles. And it wasn't coming from inside. No windows lit up, no porch, just the roof glowing. I slowed almost to a crawl, staring at it through the windshield. The fields around the house were pitch black, no stars overhead thanks to the cloud cover. I couldn't see anything above it. No aircraft lights, no beam, nothing. Just the roof itself glowing softly for maybe 5 or 6 seconds. Then it went completely dark again. Not faded, just off, like a switch had been thrown. The house was a black shape against the night again, no different from the first time I'd passed it. I didn't stop. My foot pressed harder on the gas without me deciding. The truck rattled as I sped up, gravel spitting from the tires. When I glanced in the mirror, there was nothing but my taillights reflecting off the road. For the next half hour, I kept checking the GPS, trying to reassure myself I was where I was supposed to be. The map looked normal, the road names matched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been pushed off my usual loop somehow. At my next drop, I nearly dropped the keys, pulling them from the night box. My hands were shaking, and I had to stand there breathing for a minute before I could get back in the cab. On the way home, I rerouted completely to avoid that stretch. Even so, the whole drive, I felt like the sky above me was too heavy, like something was following along just out of sight. When I finally parked the truck back at the depot, I shut the engine off and just sat there. The silence pressed in, no glow, no sound, nothing unusual, just a normal night. Except I can still picture that house, black as coal one second, the roof glowing faint and wrong the next. And I never passed it again on that route, even though the GPS swore I should have. I was halfway between the highway and the split that takes you down to Maple Street when I first noticed the light in my rear view. It looked like a headlight at first, a soft round glow, the color of a flashlight through fog, but there was no one behind me close enough for headlights to show up that big. I checked the mirror again, slow and casual like I always do, expecting to see a taillight or a pickup truck. Nothing, just a pale point of light hanging low, staying put in the mirror as if it were stuck to the glass. I drove on. It was late, just after midnight, and I should have been tired. I had worked the late shift at the clinic, charting and emptying the break room coffee, thinking about the pile of laundry at home. The road was the usual ribbon, 2 lanes, white paint, the faint orange of distant sodium lamps. The radio was a low hum of static and half-hearted country songs. Outside the windows, the trees leaned in like they were listening. The light stayed directly in the center of the mirror, no matter how I adjusted my head. When I glanced at the dash, the clock read 12:14. I told myself it was a reflection from somewhere up the valley, a farmhouse, maybe, a hunting camp light I hadn't noticed. That sounded fine until I took the exit that drops off the highway and onto the county road. Slow speed, the way you always do. The glow in the mirror slowed with me, keeping that same distance. It wasn't approaching, it simply mirrored my motion. A car did finally catch up to me at a long crest and passed, its taillights blinking red in the mirror. For a second, the little bright thing flickered against the passing lights, and I thought maybe that explained it. A distant, fixed light on a hill, magnified by the curve of the mirror. But when the taillights had passed and there was nothing but my own empty lane, the small glow reasserted itself, steady and faint, like a memory of light. My hands tightened on the wheel. I tried to describe it in my head. Not warm, not like yellow street lamps. It had a thin, almost paper-white quality, as if someone had tucked a small moon into a jar. The road narrowed, and the shoulder dropped away into scrub. Somewhere a dog barked, twice, then quiet. On the crest of a hill, I flicked on the brights for a beat out of habit, and the glow didn't react. It sat there, indifferent. I took the county road that cuts under the ridgeline because it was quieter than the main road, even at that hour. The map app on my phone was asleep in the passenger seat. I'd turned it off to save the battery. I remember thinking for a second that wasn't important, just a practical thing. Then the little light in the mirror shifted, like it was nudged, so that it now sat a little to the left in the glass, as if it were tracking something behind me. I rolled the window down for fresh air because the car felt stuffy. The night smelled like rain left over in the asphalt, clean and dark. There were more leaves on the road than usual, slick and black. The hum of traffic on the main road was gone. The hum in the quiet after that was the only thing that sat wrong. Not a sound of any one thing, more a presence of stillness that seemed to thicken everything else. When I pulled up behind a truck, able to make the winding county road at the posted speed, the glow positioned itself exactly in line with the truck's trough of red taillights, but slightly dimmer. If I eased forward to pass, it shifted with me, always keeping that small space between us. When I fell back, it fell back. I kept thinking I would turn around at the next turnout and check, see some idiot parked on the shoulder with a lantern. But there was nowhere to turn safely on that stretch. The only break was a narrow church parking lot a mile farther, and by then my palms were steady, but I found myself not wanting to reach for the wheel more than necessary. I had this image in my head of the light being something private to the road, something that didn't care if it had an audience. I passed mile markers and mailboxes I could normally recite without thinking. At one point, a deer stood at the edge of the trees and watched me, eyes reflecting in a way that made them look like 2 small coins. The deer didn't spook as I slowed. It blinked and turned away, and for a moment the calm of that animal made the glow in the mirror feel less alien. It didn't answer to anything, so I kept going. My phone vibrated in the seat next to me. A text from Maria asking if I was coming by in the morning. Nothing important, the kind of domestic thing that usually pulled me right out of a fog. I ignored it. When I did look, the mirror showed nothing different, but now the light in the glass seemed higher, like it had lifted with the angle of the road or the tilt of my car. Maybe I was inventing the movements, or maybe my mind was compensating for the fact that it refused to be anything ordinary. At the intersection before the stretch of road with the softball field, the streetlights flickered, a quick, city-style dip, once, twice, like an electrical system clearing a power surge. My headlights dipped too, shadows stacking briefly across the dashboard, and for a beat, my car felt like it was holding its breath. When the lights came back, the glow in the mirror had doubled. There were now two pale points, spaced a little apart like a pair of distant eyes. I pulled off the road into a grocery store parking lot because my brain needed the ordinary geometry of overhead lights and painted lanes. I sat with the engine on and the shifter in park, and the glow, whether one spot or two, sat right in the mirror the way someone sits expectant at the edge of a chair. There was no sound, no rustle beyond the store's humming freezer units. A long-haul semi rolled in and turned under the sodium bulbs, and for a moment the mirror was a confetti of lights, and then the semi took off, and the glow was alone again. I opened my mouth to laugh at myself and closed it. The laugh felt brittle. When I pulled back onto the road, the light followed without drama. It kept the same distance, whether I was doing 30 or 60, no tailgating, no urging, just a patient alignment to my rear view. I went through town, and the glow hung in the mirror above the wink of apartment windows and the low sweep of the creek. A pair of teenagers leaned against their car on the corner laughing at something. They didn't notice me. The normality of those small, stupid moments made the thing in the mirror seem stranger by contrast. The minutes stretched. I thought about flicking on the hazards and stopping on the shoulder to look in the rear view and see exactly what was following me, but the idea felt like a test I wasn't ready to take. I didn't like the idea of revealing myself as the only attentive thing on the road. I kept my speed, hands at 9 and 3, and breathed in the scent of my coffee warming in the cup holder. When I finally turned onto my street, the one lined with maples that throw down a canopy and narrow the road to one lane, the glow backed off a hair. I told myself that must be coincidence. Maybe streetlights on smaller roads scatter distant light differently. My house was a quarter-mile down, and I signaled and eased into the turn, the way a person who has driven the same route all their life does. The porch light across the road sputtered on and then was steady. A neighbor's window lamp switched off. The moment the tires climbed the small curb into my driveway, the light in the mirror blinked once, like a slow shutter snap, and then it was gone. Not faded, not moved out of frame, gone as if the world had flipped a switch I didn't know existed. I sat there with the car idling and the radio playing nothing louder than a test tone. Outside, my yard looked the way it always did. The gash of shadow under the maple, the folded rug on the porch from where I'd left it drying. My hands shook a little as I reached up and adjusted the mirror, making sure it wasn't glued or stained. Inside, everything seemed the same as when I'd left. The kettle I never seemed to remember turning off was cold. Lights on the counters were off. Maria's truck wasn't in the driveway. She was staying at her sister's, she had said. I told myself to make tea, check the answers on the charts, call Maria about coming by in the morning. The ordinary chores had an orchestrating effect, arranging the night's edges back into the shape I recognized. I don't know how long I sat in the quiet before I turned the key and walked up the steps. The light had vanished from the mirror without a trace. It might have been a reflection, a trick of terrain and distant lamps, a hunter's lantern on a ridgeline, something perfectly explainable. And I tried that explanation on more than once, like a coat that almost fit. But none of the fits felt complete. The way it had matched me lane for lane, the way it had doubled for a breath, the timing of the flicker at the exact moment I pulled into my drive, those were details that sat in my chest and refused to be smoothed over. I shut the car door softly and carried the small heat of it up the walk. The porch light buzzed when I reached for the switch. Inside, the clock on the microwave read 12:47. I worried first about the work I'd left undone. Then I worried about nothing at all, the kind of empty worry that follows a thing you can't explain. I stepped inside and flicked on the kitchen light, the familiar warm yellow washing out the edges of the night. When I lay down that night, I kept one ear tuned to the house, the refrigerator's low purr, the street's distant sigh, the maple's leaves agreeing with the wind. The world kept to its own business. The glow didn't return. The mirror on the car outside was ordinary glass. I told myself I had seen what I'd seen, and that was that. And then I tried to fall asleep, which is how I always ended the strange nights, by pretending the ordinary was enough. I pulled into the Dust Devil Diner around midnight because I needed coffee and a quiet booth more than I needed the motel 3 miles down the road. The lot was half full, local rigs and a couple of sedans that looked like people had been there long enough to sleep in the chairs. The sky was pure, desert black with a sharp band of stars near the horizon. It was one of those nights that felt like it belonged to the road. Clear, cold after sunset. Silence pressed thin. Inside, the neon over the counter buzzed that lazy hum you get with old glass tubes. The sign outside the diner and the motel across the street and the gas station at the corner all threw their colors into the parking lot, giving Chrome a warm fairground look. I sat with my elbows on the formica and ordered coffee, black, and a grilled cheese, comfort food that didn't require any thinking. The first thing that was off was the jukebox. It had been playing something old and scratchy when I walked in, a Patsy Cline record that fit the place. Then the music died mid-verse. The needle hit silent, and there was this little electrical tick. The waitress didn't even glance up. She took my order like nothing happened. The coffee machine gave one long sigh and settled. People went on talking. I thought maybe the jukebox had jammed. I didn't think further about it. I was halfway through my sandwich when the neon signs dimmed. Not a gradual fade like at dawn, but a synchronized dip, like someone had turned a master dimmer. The red of the Dust Devil sign went thin. The motel's letters looked bruised. The gas pump's green halo shuddered. The whole lot lost a third of its light, and it made the chrome of rigs look like they had been painted with a darker silver. It was the sameness of it that pulled at me. Every sign, all the bulbs, blinking lower in the same second. The waitress paused with a pot over the burner like she'd been caught in mid-breath. A trucker at the counter crooked his head and said, "What the?" and then shut up because even his voice sounded loud in the thinning light. Then everything else quieted. The low hum of the diner fridge softened and then stopped. The road noise that usually hummed past the pumps on a night like that went oddly inaudible. No trucks down the highway, no distant tires on hot asphalt. A moth that had been flitting near a lamplight froze against the window for a beat and then dropped to the sill. Small things, ordinary things, rearranged themselves into a pattern that made my mouth go dry. My phone lost signal. The little bars in the corner jumped from 1 to none like an old elevator. The CB in my cab, a habit I check out of reflex, gave me nothing but static when I flipped it on after slipping back into my jacket. The clock over the counter was blinking 12, like a power outage had married it to a microwave. The waitress frowned, then shrugged and wiped the counter as if wiping could take the moment away. I stepped outside because the air felt wrong in my chest. The lot felt empty, even though there were trucks. The desert wind that usually dove across the asphalt and threw gravel at the curb had stopped somewhere out by the highway. The neon was a dull watercolor from across the street, and the chrome on the rig I had parked next to looked like a sculpted boot, dark and patient. The movement came next. It started as a pale smear at the far edge of the lot, near the motel's roped-off sign, and it moved across the asphalt. It wasn't a car, not really. No engine, no headlights, just a slow horizontal wash of light, the color of a moon behind a thin cloud. It drifted, not fast, not with the precise motion of a drone, but like someone had set a lantern on the wind, and then the wind forgot to blow. When it reached the rigs, it made the chrome breathe. For a moment, the light lay across the hood of my truck and the bars of its grille like a hand passing over a page. The reflection slid along the cab, a pale stroke that made my name on the door look ghostly. I put my palm on the metal where the light had been and felt only cold and beads of condensation from the night air. No heat, no residue, just that faint, wrong light casting itself and then being gone. The motel sign dimmed again, the same synchronized dip. The waitress stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame, her face a map of small surprises. A couple of guys at a corner booth pushed their chairs back. One of them went out to look, leaving his plate half-eaten. He came back in and sat down like he had decided not to tell a story. Silence is a language truckers understand. We catalog little things. We talk about strange stops, about lights over the highway, about coyotes that act wrong, but most of the time we keep whatever list to ourselves. I watched the pale wash go from rig to rig. It didn't touch the ground. It lay across things like a film over an old photograph. When it crossed the chrome on my mirror, it made my eyes ache a little. Not because it was bright, but because it had depth. It looked like someone had taken a shallow bowl of diluted paint and dragged it along the lot, and the brushstroke had a mind of its own. After it passed the last truck, it climbed the motel pole and vanished into the sky. There was a moment, a fraction, maybe two, where the motel sign winked back to normal and the pumps hummed again like a sigh. A flea market neon cross on the far side of the lot blinked entirely off and on, as if to reassure itself. The jukebox in the diner flared to life with a metallic pop and started in the middle of a song. The moth on the sill flew away, puzzled. My phone chimed like it had received a dozen messages at once, and the bars in the corner returned. I kept thinking about scale, how far away that light had to be for it to look like a thin wash, and whether anything that size could move so deliberately and silently over an open lot. I thought about filing a report, calling the local PD, putting something official on paper. I didn't. I remember telling myself the next day I'd be rational, that if I put it into words now, it'd sound dumb. So I drank the coffee they refilled for me and ate the second grilled cheese and left a tip in the jar. I climbed back into the cab and sat for a few minutes with the engine running and the heater doing its slow work. My hands didn't stop moving, thumb rubbing over the steering wheel, fingers finding the pockets where spare coins lived. The radio picked up a clear station then, summer-old country music, and the static I'd had earlier cleared like someone had taken a brush to glass. When I pulled out of the lot, the world felt rearranged. The lights along the highway were normal. The horizon was a hard line. The rigs rolled past in their lanes and drivers waved as they do. I rolled west for another 100 miles until dawn bled into the sky and the desert turned from coal to ash to something with color. I stopped at a rest area and slept in the cab for an hour. The kind of sleep where you never really get your breath back. I thought about calling someone afterward, telling a buddy at the yard something that might get me laughed at or at least an eye roll. I thought about it and then I didn't. That evening I put my name on the log, signed for my load, and drove the miles the way I always did. Low gear, steady speed, mind on the road and the road only. There were jokes at the truck stop about phantom lights and desert mirages, stories told loud and loose. People swapped them to keep the long hours bright. I smiled and took a coffee refill. When I finally pulled into my driveway at home, the streetlight by the mailbox was a stubborn single orange. I killed the engine and sat there for a minute, the truck cooling with a sigh. My daughter came out with a flashlight to meet me, hair wild from sleep, and she threw her arms around me like I was the whole world. The house smelled of something baking, ordinary and stubborn. I didn't tell her. I told my wife, but only the small parts, a dim, some lights going off. She hummed and said, maybe the county had been doing maintenance. I can kill the story with how reasonable people make reality sound, how a plausible explanation slides into a small space and fills it. I didn't push. I didn't tell the part about the light lying across my grill like a thin hand. I didn't tell the part about the way the jukebox hit a glitch and then came back in mid-song. Every now and then, I drive back out that way when the weather is right, when the sky is spare and the highway is empty and the Dust Devil sign still leans like a patient sentinel. I sit in my rig and wait, because waiting is what you do when something doesn't fit the shelf of normal. Sometimes nothing happens and the lot is just a lot, neon humming and pumps waiting. Sometimes I swear I see the faintest smudge above the motel and then I blink and it's gone. Mostly I chalk it up to the road. It's tricks. It's quiet. Mostly I go on with the regular jobs, emptying trailers, threading miles like beads in a string, calling in loads, hearing my daughter's voice through the receiver. But there are times when I polish the chrome at dusk and the reflection is too clean, and I find my hand pausing where a pale light might brush it. In that pause, the memory isn't an explanation, it's just a motion, like the night reaching out and then drawing back. I'd been out on Lake Brindle before sunrise plenty of times, but that morning was different. I left the cabin around 4:45 a.m., the air thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. The fog hadn't lifted yet, hanging over the water like a gray blanket. I'd been fishing these waters for years, alone or with friends, and I knew the lake well enough to sense when something was off. I pushed the little aluminum boat into the water, the oars cutting quietly through the mist. Normally, even when the surface looks calm, there's always a slight ripple from the wind, from fish, from insects skimming the top. But that morning, it was perfect. Not a single ripple, not a faint tremor, nothing. The water looked like black glass, reflecting the faint light of the moon and the first hints of dawn. I sat in the boat, letting it drift a little, listening to the fog swallowing every sound. No birds, no frogs, no insects, only the quiet slap of the oars when I moved them. I thought maybe it was just a fluke, the lake calm for once, but I felt the tension in my chest tighten a little. That little hum of unease you get when something familiar starts to look wrong. I cast a line toward the middle of the lake and let it sink. The bobber didn't twitch. I sat there for a long time, trying to settle into the rhythm of it, breathing, listening, waiting. That's when I noticed something in the corner of my eye. Faint lights under the water. Tiny, soft glows, like pale lanterns drifting slowly beneath the surface. At first, I thought maybe it was a reflection of the moon or the cabin lights behind me. But the reflections don't move against the water, and these lights did. They slid beneath the surface, gliding through the black like they were part of it, not on it. I froze, holding the oar halfway in the water, me trying to see better. My heart picked up. The lights weren't consistent. Sometimes there were two, sometimes three, sometimes just a shimmer. They moved slowly, almost lazily, but deliberately, like they were examining the lake. I leaned forward, squinting, and one of them flashed brighter for a moment, then vanished. I thought about calling someone, my brother maybe, but I didn't. No one would be awake yet, and the thought of waking anyone to see something like this felt pointless. I wasn't sure I even believed it myself. Maybe it was fish, some strange reflection of the fog. But I've fished here enough to know that no fish glowed. No fish moved like that, deliberately, with no ripples on the surface. I tried to move the boat closer to where the lights had been. The oars didn't break the water's mirror, but I could feel the cold brushing my hands. Every time I reached the spot where the glow had lingered, it was gone. But then it would appear somewhere else, always just below the surface, always vanishing when I focused on it directly. The fog thinned a little as the sun started to push through orange and pale against the horizon. Normally, the birds would be starting their morning chorus, the loons calling back and forth, the insects skimming the water. But everything was silent. The lake stayed glassy, unmoving. I leaned back, trying to shake it off, tell myself it was some trick of light, maybe bioluminescent algae or a reflection of the fog catching the first rays of sun. But it wasn't algae. I've seen algae bloom, I've fished this lake in every season, and it moved too quickly, too cleanly for that. After maybe 20 minutes, the lights vanished entirely. No shimmer, no glow, no flicker, just the water again, perfect and still, like nothing had ever been there. I drifted for a while longer, staring down at the black glass, feeling a kind of hollow awe. My line never moved. I didn't hear any splash, any shift in the lake, nothing. When I finally rowed back toward the shore, the world felt muted. The birds were just starting, the fog beginning to lift, the sun catching the tips of the pines. The water rippled under the oars, normal again. I hauled the boat out, secured it, and walked back to the cabin. I didn't tell anyone about the lights. Not my brother, not my fishing buddies. Who would believe that the lake had been alive for a while, moving beneath the surface, unseen but felt? I wasn't scared exactly, not in the usual way. It was more like I had witnessed something fragile, fleeting, not meant to be fully understood. That evening, I sat on the porch with a beer, looking out at the lake as the sun set. The water rippled normally, reflecting the sky and the trees, and yet I kept thinking about the way it had been that morning. Still, perfect, and alive with lights that didn't belong. I keep wondering if it will happen again. And sometimes, when the wind is still and the water looks like black glass, I swear I see a faint shimmer beneath the surface, moving just out of reach. We got the tent up as the light was going, the kind of quick, efficient move that comes from doing it together a dozen times. I'd driven the F-150 up the dirt track, Maya hauled the cooler and the lantern, and by the time the sun was down, we had a small ring of fire, 2 folding chairs, and a bag of marshmallows on the stump. It was late October, the air thin and sweet with that dry, leaf-burnt smell. We'd come because the city had been loud and work had been mean. A night in the woods sounded like an easy fix. The first odd thing didn't look odd at first. The smoke from the fire pulled up in a narrow column instead of feathering out. That happens sometimes when the air is calm, I figured. Chimneys do the same. Maya nudged me with her elbow and said, "Look at that," like she was pointing out a deer. I followed her gaze, waiting to see a raccoon or a wandering fox, and realized the smoke wasn't just straight. It twisted, but not like a whirl of wind. It wound in tight, slow spirals, like a ribbon caught on an invisible rod. I told myself the air must be dead calm, that the trees were blocking whatever breeze there usually was. We sat closer and talked about surface-level things. The drive, the muffins the ranger had suggested at the gas station, a report at work that could have waited. The smoke kept doing the same thing, rising in stacked coils, sometimes separating into 3 thin streams that braided for a second and then snapped back into one. It made the firelight strange, as if the glow from the embers was being filtered through glass. Then the quiet tightened. I'm used to the forest having a soundtrack at night. A distant pack of coyotes, the chitter of mice, 100 tiny things private to themselves. That night, the woods went almost mute. Small sounds like the creek we'd crossed on the way here were reduced to a suggestion. An owl called once from the ridge, and it stopped mid-hoot like someone had cut the microphone. Even Scout, the neighbor's Labrador we'd let off the leash earlier so he could run, stopped nosing at the leaves and sat down, head up, staring into the dark. Dogs notice things first. Maya pulled the blanket up over her knees and said, "That's weird, the way people say things that are true and don't need further argument." I got up to ruffle a log and the smoke braided around my head without touching me. It moved with a slow deliberateness, and when it passed, the air felt thinner for a second, like someone had taken out a breath you didn't know you were holding. My palms were damp, though the night was cool, and the hairs along my forearm prickled at the same time. They made no sense. We decided to crank the little battery radio under the lantern to a station for company. The first dial click was normal static, then something else, hitched notes, like a far-off train whistle, not rhythmic but tonal. The voice on the radio was there and then gone. Whatever frequency we picked up would fade into nothing for a few minutes, then come back with no explanation. At one point, the radio played a snippet of local traffic, and then, for 3 whole minutes, tuned to nothing but a quiet hum that felt like the inside of a cave. I tried the phone. 1 bar, then none. Signal search. No messages came through. Small visual things happened that I could have dismissed if I wanted to. The camp's shadows were odd. Where the fire should have cast direct, wide shadows, the dark stretched up the trunks of the trees in thin fingers as if reaching for the canopy. Maya said, "They look like they're climbing," and I laughed because that's what you do when you want the mood to stay light. But the laugh fell flat. Even my smile felt rehearsed, like something I'd said before, and now forgot why. Then the light showed. It was faint at first, like a pale smear against the black between branches, a white I can only describe as the color of the underside of clouds lit by a distant city. It hung up in the treetops, maybe 30 yards away, drifting without wind. It slid along the ridgeline like a lantern someone carried very smoothly from tree to tree. But there was no sound of steps, no rustle in the leaves where it passed. The glow didn't pick out details the way a flashlight does. It filled a space with a thin, hollow sort of illumination, enough to make the branch silhouettes hard-edged and to make the smoke look like glass filaments. We weren't the only ones who saw it. The couple in the site next to ours, 2 guys in their 50s who had driven in with a base boat in the afternoon, stood up and walked to the edge of their picnic table. The older one, Mike, squinted through a bottle and muttered, "What the hell is that?" His friend slipped his jacket on and peered into the tree line like a man who thinks he might still get to be practical about this. The glow moved more deliberately as we watched. Sometimes it would thin and then expand like someone was rubbing the air, shaping it into something near solid. For a while, it stayed just above the branches, and the night felt like sea after a storm. Everything in place, but layered differently. My throat dried like I'd been laughing for an hour. Maya put her hand on my arm, small, steady. "Do you think we should go?" she asked, which meant the same as, "Do you think we should stay?" And I knew which choice felt safer and which felt braver. We did what most sensible people would do. We packed slow, not frantic. The tent came down in the comfortable sequence of practiced movement: fold, clip, stuff. We filled the cooler, coiled the cord for the lantern. Nobody said, "Run." The couple packing next to us moved with the same calm urgency. The radio had resumed normal music as if apologizing for its earlier lapse. The smoke braided the same way as I rolled the sleeping pad into its stuff sack, slow and careful. But I had the feeling that if I squinted, just so I could see the steps of whatever had been moving in the treetops. Before we left, I went to toss a match stub into the fire pit, and the smoke tightened into a small column that rose and then unfurled like a palm opening. For a second, it looked structured, like the outline of something deliberate. Then, it dissolved back into the sky. The glow overhead shifted once more, as if checking the campsite, and then began to drift away along the ridge. It didn't move with the wind, since there wasn't a wind. It just slid through the trees and faded into the darker band where the pines burned into the black of the slope. We left the lantern on low to be polite and walked to the truck in the same silence the woods had kept. The road out was dust and dead leaves, and my headlights cut cones into the dark. Once we'd cleared the last bend and the campsites were behind us, the night opened into the full sound of the forest again. Crickets, a distant motor, the thin call of an owl completing the hoot it had started. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd held, and felt stupid for holding it so tightly all at once. We didn't tell anyone at the ranger station. The guys at the pump when we stopped for coffee shrugged when Maya mentioned it. Maybe fog, maybe a hunter with a lantern, maybe a downed power line. But their faces had that look people get when they are trying not to say something that might make them sound crazy. I told my sister the story when I got home the next day over beer and laundry, and she laughed and asked if I'd been watching too many late-night shows. I didn't bother telling her about the way the smoke wound itself into shapes that looked almost like letters, or the way the glow paused and seemed to watch us pack. Some things sound more like evidence when someone else hears them, and some things don't. That week, I kept finding ash on my jacket whenever I took it off, and when I shook it out, it fell in neat little rings like tiny smoke glyphs. I joked about it and then folded the jacket away. Sometimes at night, when the apartment was quieter than it should be and the city was a low hum, I'd see a corner of light in the corner of my mind and imagine it moving down the skyline like that pale drift in the treetops. Maya said she sometimes woke up smelling wood smoke, even though the heater was off. She said it like it was an excuse for more camping. I didn't say anything back because I didn't want to pull the thread on a memory that might unravel into something else. We went back once, a month later. The place was a normal campsite in daylight. Kids, a stack of canoe rentals, the ranger's truck pulling someone's trailer out of the mud. At dusk, the wind picked up off the ridge and the smoke behaved like smoke. Nothing braided, nothing glowed in the trees. We sat late with our backs to the fire and told stories out loud until the normal things filled the night. Still, when we packed up in the dark to leave, I found myself folding the sleeping bag with practiced hands, looking up once if checking that the treetops were ordinary, and not seeing something curious drifting between the branches that could have been taken for a lantern or a cloud, or for nothing at all. I got to the dock before dawn because that's when the lake felt like it belonged to me. The town was still asleep, houses dark and shuttered, and the air had that wet, cold feel it gets when fog has been sitting on the water all night. I carried the little Coleman cooler and my rod across the planks, boots thumping hollow. There was a thin sound, my breath, the creak of old wood, and nothing else for a while. I liked that silence. It tuned out the week I'd had and left room for nothing but the lake. I had been coming out here for years. Not a big operation, just me, a folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and some night crawlers. The dock was the kind that sagged in the middle, the boards bleached and salted from storms, the pilings black with algae. The light on the post clicked on because that's what it did at first light, a weak bulb that threw a small halo in the mist. I sat, set up my line, and let the bobber drift out past the pilings. At first, everything was ordinary. The bobber sat there like a little star, no bites, the rod resting across my knees. The fog made the world hush. It swallowed sound and softened edges. A distant gull called once, then nothing. I drank coffee that tasted like the road and stared out, the way you do when you're waiting for a bite or trying to think straight. Something else felt off before I actually saw it. The surface of the water was too smooth. Even when I had had still mornings before, there was usually a skitter, an insect, a fish feeding shallow, the wake of a passing canoe. That morning the lake was glassed over, so flat it looked like a sheet of black glass. I remember thinking that it was beautiful and wrong at the same time. Then I saw the reflection. It wasn't a reflection of the sky. It lay on the surface like a coin placed on a table, round, pale, a soft light that moved with astonishing slowness just under the skin of the water. If you had been standing next to me, you'd have seen the lake look like it had a small moon rolling under the surface, the light diffused and calm. It hovered maybe 10 feet from the dock and made a circle about the size of a dinner plate. The rings where it touched the water weren't ripples, they were the faintest suggestion of a disturbance, like someone had pressed a fingertip to gel. I leaned forward without thinking, the way you do when a strange animal walks into the yard. The closer I got, the clearer it became that this light wasn't a trick of fog. When I bent down, the wood of the dock creaked, and the light pulsed almost imperceptibly, like it was responding to the movement in the world above. It didn't reflect anything I knew. No moon, no lamplight, no glow from the town. It was inside the water and not on it at the same time. I reached out my hand, not to touch because there was a small voice in me that said, "Don't," but to steady myself on the railing. The air near the surface felt a degree colder than the air a foot back. When I put my hand over the spot, the skin on my fingers prickled, like the tiny static shiver you get before a storm. The light stayed, steady as if I held my breath for it. Something rubbed my ankle. It was only a small fish, startled maybe, because I had my paddle resting near the pilings and it bumped the line. My bobber jerked and then settled. I thought for a second that the little disturbance had moved the light. But when I looked back, the circle had slid half a foot to the left, deliberately, as if something under the surface was nudging itself along the plane. Not random, not like the frenzied flick of a bait fish. It moved smooth and slow. I took out my phone, the reflex of a man who wants a record of oddness. The screen flashed awake and the camera app opened, but the image on the screen was just fog and black water. When I pointed it at the glow, the light didn't register. The phone gave me a pale smear, like the camera couldn't reconcile the fog and the glow together. I snapped a picture anyway. It saved, then in the gallery the photo showed nothing but a gray blur. I deleted it because even the act of saving made me feel ridiculous. The thing under the water didn't make a sound. No bubbling, no plop, nothing that usually goes with movement in a liquid. It was silent like a ghost. I kept watching it and kept thinking up explanations. Some bioluminescent critter, reflections from a passing boat. But later that morning when the fog lifted and the first fisherman came out, the water around the dock looked ordinary as an old tire. No algae bloom, no jelly, no lights of any kind. The glow moved again and this time it rose. It didn't leap or shoot. It lifted slow like someone easing a balloon away. The light slid upward through the fog in a soft column until the fog swallowed it and it vanished. There was no splash, no sound. For a moment, the surface of the lake stayed as placid as before, as if nothing had been there at all. The thermos in my lap seemed too loud in that pause. I stayed there for a long time after it disappeared. My coffee went cold. Crows started to argue in the trees, and a pickup puttered down the access road toward the launch. I tried to tell myself it was some natural phenomenon that had an ordinary name, but the plain fit didn't come. A fisherman arrived with his son, smiling and loud. He set up a rod 2 slips down and cracked a plastic chair. He asked me if I'd been getting anything, and I told him a half-truth. No, nothing, and he laughed and said, "Rough night?" Like that. That explained everything. The compulsion was to go back to sleep or to the town and forget it, but I found I couldn't. I packed up slowly, rolled my line, and checked the knots. The dock looked the same in broad sight. The algae on the pilings, the slick where rain had run, the way gulls made a mess on the rail. Up top, the world was as it always was on the lake, a dog-barked morning starting over. The oddness felt small and precise, tucked into the seam where water met air. On the way home, I stopped at the hardware store. I bought a new bulb for the dock light because it had been flickering the week before, and I figured I could fix that routine thing. The clerk, a man named Pete, who'd been a fisherman his whole life, asked how the morning had been, and I left out the glowing circle and the way it rose into fog. I told him about the weather and how calm the water had been. He nodded because that's what people who work with lakes do. They catalog conditions. He said, sometimes the lake does tricks, and I chalked it up to him keeping his mouth open for a conversation. That afternoon, I tugged on a beer and sat on the back steps, watching the lake through the haze of heat. The sun had burned most of the fog away, and the dock was bright and ordinary. Kids were diving off the far buoy, and the oars of a canoe cut neat white trails across the lake. All the ordinary things seemed to be patting the memory down so it wouldn't roll. I read a page of a book and kept checking the window like a child. I didn't go back out for a week. I kept my tackle box in the garage and the rod leaning against the wall, both of them angular with use. I called the friend who runs the bait shop and asked if anyone had reported anything weird. He snorted and said no one had said anything about ghost lights. He laughed at me for a minute, but I heard a note in his voice, a small hesitation, as if he decided not to dismiss me outright. When I finally went back to the dock, it was late and empty, and the light on the post hissed to life like it always did. I sat where I had before, the wood warm from the day, and cast out less to fish than to see the place with my presence. The lake was its usual mirror, flicked now and then by carp or breeze, and I felt a little foolish for being afraid the water would show me something odd again. Nothing did. The night folded itself into itself normally. I packed up at first light with no stories but the one I'd been keeping in my own head. At breakfast, I told my wife about the stillness and how perfect the lake had been. She said the word beautiful like it was a blank check and left it at that. I didn't tell her about reaching out with my hand or about the way the light slid into the fog like it was moving up a ladder. There are things that happen on water that people accept without comment. Sudden squalls, strange runs of fish, the way a breeze can arrive like a percussionist. This wasn't one of those things I could put a label on and set in the proper drawer. It was a small private event the lake seemed to have made for no audience. I keep my rod where it belongs, and I still go out sometimes when the weather's right. I fish for the quiet and the chance to be alone with the water. If the light ever comes back, I'll be there. If it doesn't, I'll tell the same story the next time someone asks how the morning went. The lake was flat, and everything felt like it was listening. Then I'll shrug and pour another cup of coffee, because that's what you do when something odd passes through the life you live and leaves you with the simplest trace of it. A small, inexplicable memory that sits in your pocket like a smooth stone. It was 2:17 a.m. when the monitors started glitching. I'd been alone for hours behind the counter at the Corner Quick on the south side. 2 liters lined up like glass trophies, the chip rack already half empty, coffee on the warmer that tasted like burnt patience. I'd clocked in at 11 and settled into the parts of the job that don't need thinking. Sweep under the cigarette wall, restock the energy drinks, shuffle a stack of scratch-offs into the little plastic stand. The fluorescent over the slushy machine hummed in that way it does when it's tired, and the little fan above the deli counter rattled like an old man clearing his throat. The first glitch was small, a pixel hiccup on camera 3, the feed that looks over the east lot. 1 second it showed the cracked asphalt and a row of shopping carts. The next, the image smeared into horizontal bars like an old VHS being fast-forwarded and then jerked back. I watched it with the kind of casual attention Hour 3 on night shift gives you. The barista across the street used to say the screens were the real company art. You could watch the night show for free. I chuckled at the screen and wiped down the counter. Then the lot lights blinked. It wasn't the municipal lights, those stay on a whole, steady glow. But the ones above our pump canopy did a little dip, not a total outage, more like a breath. The cash drawer buzzed in sympathy. I told myself it was a storm somewhere east that hadn't reached us yet. We get power sags. They happen, but there was no wind at all. The air outside tasted like an open soda bottle, flat but clean. A second camera flickered, then a third. The feeds jumped out of sync. On monitor 1, the automatic door's reflection wavered, while on 2, where the lot was normally empty, a smear of pale light slid across the asphalt and then disappeared. I leaned in. On the paused frame, it looked like a smear of fog a human hand might scoop up. Live, it moved like someone had rubbed the screen with their thumb. My stomach tightened the way it does when a bus brakes too fast. Practical things rattled through me. Camera wiring loose, someone testing equipment, a truck passing with lights so low you'd only see strangeness through glass. I flipped the monitor to full screen the east lot and froze. The feed returned to normal for a second. Empty lot, pumps sleeping, a stray shopping cart by the fence. Then the image blinked again, and in the space of the blink a pale circle drifted from the far edge toward the middle, slow and intentional. There were no cars in the lot. The pumps read zeros. The store's AC unit hummed steady behind me. The pale thing moved without wind, with a smoothness like a float in a parade, and its edges were too regular for fog. It looked like a handheld lantern seen underwater, soft, forgetful of corners. The light slid past the pumps just where you'd expect a car to park if anyone had been coming in, and it left the asphalt untouched. No wet streaks, no reflections, nothing. I should have stood up. I should have crossed the floor and looked out the real window. Instead, I sat, the service bell, pressing into the meat of my palm, because part of my brain was still keeping the list of things I had to do. Count the till, sweep the gum off the entry mat, check the date on the milk. Pride is a weird thing when you've been trained to hold a line. It keeps you planted. The light paused under camera 3 like it was considering a parking space, then drifted on, past the deli window and the cigarette rack, right over the painted handicap stripe, and that's when the feed snapped back to plain, ordinary night. One frame it was there. The next frame, the lot was empty. No light, no movement. The pumps were lit, the vending machine in the corner glowed its usual tired blue, and the world outside the glass looked like the world always looked at 3 a.m. Quiet, slightly mean. I checked the door. It was still locked. The automatic sensors had not cycled. The exterior lights outside the canopy were on full. I fumbled for the headset and flipped it to the store frequency, the old safety call we use when a car is slow to pay or a homeless guy wants to nap in the entryway. The radio answered with static, then a voice I didn't know for half a second, like a whisper hiding behind the hiss, and then nothing. The display on the two-way showed no service. My phone in my pocket had next to nothing earlier, then jumped to searching and sat there like it was confused. For the next few minutes, anytime I looked up from the counter, one of the cameras would glitch. A smear here, a horizontal skip there. The glitches didn't line up the same way twice. The east lot would blink, then be fine. Camera 5, over the rear alley, would roll into gray. The feed from up on the roof looked like someone had placed a sieve in front of it. Once, the night shift clerk from the gas station down the block, which stayed open while truckers used their bathrooms, phoned the store phone. I answered on the second ring, and he said something odd about a white light moving across his lot, then the line went dead. I tried to call him back. The number rang and finally hit nothing. I told myself to get up, to walk out, to prove the cameras wrong. I'm not especially brave. I'm just stubborn when it comes to being in charge of a place for a few hours. I locked the glass door open with the chain, stepped into the cold, and smelled the night. Diesel fumes and the bakery's warm sugar that rode the downwind from the strip to us. The parking lot was indeed empty. The lamps cast the same rigid cones. The pumps were off for the night. No one had left a car there. I walked to the spot where the camera had shown the light and found only asphalt, flaked paint, and the ring of an old oil stain. I felt stupid. Staring at the lot in the chill, I felt like a kid caught sneaking out of class. The air pressed in close, the way early morning fog will when it doesn't have anywhere to go. I came back inside and sat again, because the act of going back to the counter was like lacing up steady shoes. For the next hour, nothing visible happened. People trickled in, 2 truckers, one guy buying cigarettes who had the kind of face that never smiles, a woman getting milk. They walked under the same unblinking lamps I'd been staring at and paid with exact change. The cash register hummed and spat receipts with the boring clack that anchors a night. Yet every time I stole a glance at the big wall of monitors, one of them would be in motion, static, smear, a faint ripple in the feed, and then the image would snap back as if nothing had happened. At 3:42 a.m., the feed caught the pale light again, not out in the parking space this time, but sliding along the shadow beneath the canopy toward Bay 3. It lingered near the chrome of a long-haul rig reflected in the empty asphalt, and for 1 second the camera caught something else. A fraction of a figure. Thin, wrong-angle limbs maybe, like the thing was bending light into something human. I cursed under my breath and clicked to zoom. The next frame had no figure. The feed returned to the usual blacktop and the chrome of no truck. When my shift ended, I did the things you're supposed to do. Counted the till out loud, logged the discrepancies, made sure the coffee urn was off. Before I left, I wrote a note and stuck it under the morning manager's clipboard about the camera anomalies. She's good about that sort of thing. Calls the tech, files a report. I locked the door behind me, the chain sliding into place, and walked out into the numb air. On the drive home, my radio station cut to static for a beat and then came back to the song I'd been half listening to earlier. I told myself it had been a technical hiccup, something the system would explain away. Maybe it was a loose splice in the cable to the camera tower. Maybe a raccoon had nested inside a conduit and made enough noise to trip the sensors. Maybe I had stayed too long in the glare of the screens and my brain had invented motion. I got home, let the dog out, fed her the dry food like a ritual, and sat at the kitchen table in the blue light from the fridge while the house hummed pleasantly around me. I didn't tell my roommate the whole thing. You become careful what you load into other people's heads at 3 in the morning. He's practical. He would say, call the tech, check the log, and that would be that. Instead, I left the note on the fridge for him and went to bed with the curtains open, a crack. From the bedroom window, I could see the distant sodium glow of the strip mall, unchanged and ordinary. In the morning, I checked the store's log on my way to work the next night. There were footnotes, unexplained camera disconnections, a line about interference with unknown source, and a service ticket with a priority flagged as low because nothing had been physically damaged. The tech came by the day after and poked at wires, told me something about a faulty surge protector, and left with a polite shrug. He didn't look at the footage the way I'd seen it. He watched for errors that made sense. I kept working nights. People sometimes saw things in the footage later. Tiny blips that you could argue were lens flares or sensor noise or the sort of artifact you get from compression. The manager showed me a frame that, to her, looked like a cigarette lighter moving through the air, but we both knew there hadn't been anyone out there wanting to smoke at 2 in the morning. And every so often, when I'm arranging the slushy cups or tossing out an expired yogurt, I'll glance up at the bank of monitors and expect a smear, a pale circle, anything. Mostly, there's nothing. Mostly it's just light and asphalt and the same slow, empty hours. I went home each night after my shift. I locked my door. I left the porch light on longer. I made sure the dog was fed and the bills were paid. Life went on, ordinary in all its small, stubborn ways. The footage is still on the hard drive somewhere, a file labeled with a date and a time and tagged anomaly. I've watched it a dozen times and its ghost is always a little different, like a memory misremembering itself. I don't have an answer for what the camera's caught, and I don't have anything neat to tie it to. I only know what I was doing when the monitors started glitching where I sat, and that for a few minutes, the lot had something in it that wasn't supposed to be there at 3 in the morning. I was finishing up the last of the night checks when I first noticed the roof. It was a Thursday in late October, a clear, cold night where the air had a bite to it and you could see the whole sky like somebody had pulled back a sheet. I was supposed to be inside, coffee gone cold, thermostat nudged up, but I like to walk the yard before bed, see that everything looks like it should. The cows were quiet in the barn, chewing slow, and the big floodlight by the shop hummed the way it always hums. The silo sits a little way from the house, a round metal cylinder that fights weather and time. It holds most of next spring's feed. I keep tabs on it because if something goes wrong with the vent or the roof, it can get expensive quick. I'd been out in the fields all day hauling bales and fixing a flat on the baler, so when the radio in the truck started giving me that low static on the drive back, I shrugged it off. Static happens. Old wiring, old batteries. I swung the truck around, killed the engine, and the yard went quiet except for my boots on the gravel. First odd thing, the dog. Hank, my old border collie, followed me out to the yard and then stopped a full 10 feet from the silo and sat hard, ears forward, eyes fixed. He doesn't do that unless there's a hawk or a raccoon in the yard. He didn't bark. He stayed still, breathing like a metronome. That made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Second odd thing, the radio. When I killed the engine, the hand radio on the workbench in the shop clicked and brightened with the same static I'd been hearing driving past the apple trees. It wasn't the usual farm chatter, no trucks, no weather warning, just a thin buzz, like a mosquito far away. I went to shut the shop light off to go inside, and the bulb dimmed for a second. That annoyed me. I figured I'd been unlucky with a loose connection and went to the house to get a couple of new bulbs. On the porch, I paused, because the yard looked wrong in the floodlight. The metal roof of the silo was bright, too bright for a dark sky, and it flashed in a rhythm. Not a real flash like a camera, more of a reflective glitter, like the moon hitting wet chrome. Then it stopped. I thought maybe a cloud had passed the moon and left the reflection in pieces, but the moon was a pale sliver and behind high, thin clouds that didn't usually make the roof wink in patterns. I walked closer. Hank trailed me, but kept his distance, solemn. Up close, the roof looked like any other corrugated metal roof, dull, weathered, some rust streaks near the screws. When I stood with my hands on my hips, the roof seemed to pulse in a rhythm that matched my pulse if I let my fingers find it. I thought of an honest explanation, a farm light in town somewhere, a hunter with a spotlight, but the yard was a long stretch before any road, and the nearest neighbor was a mile away. Third odd thing, the animals. The cows in the next field had gone quiet, unnervingly quiet. You could usually hear at least one of them shift and sigh. That night they were a block of dark shapes against the field. Even the barn cats had stopped their usual circling and sat on the rafters like they'd been put there. I told myself, animals do strange things when the barometer drops or when a tractor starts up at odd hours, but the air felt like glass and everything had the wrong volume. I noticed the pulsing light in the sky after I'd been watching the roof for maybe 5 minutes. High and separate, above the tree line and over toward the west, there was a pale point of light. It wasn't a plane, no moving strobes, no steady flight path. It pulsed the same way the roof did. I tested that thought with a small movement of my head, and the flicker synced with the roof like a mirror. When the light in the sky brightened slightly, the rooftop shimmered in the same instant. When it dimmed, so did the roof. They were matching each other. My first real response was practical, check for wiring. I turned my flashlight on and walked the perimeter to the feed line that runs up to the old electric post near the silo. The pole was fine. The insulators were not cracked. Nothing was arcing. If it was a stray bulb somewhere, I couldn't find it. I walked back and looked up, and the light was still there, pulsing like a heartbeat. Something else happened that didn't make any sense. My phone died. Screen went black, and when I turned it back on, it said no service. I know the dead spots in the yard, those pockets where the trees chew up a signal, but wake the phone dead? That was a first. The clock on my dashboard reset too, then spun for a second before it set back to the right time like nothing had happened. Phones lie sometimes, wiring lies sometimes, but these little lies stacked on top of each other felt heavy. I moved to the ladder against the local barn because I figured if anything was going on with the roof, it might be easier to see from a higher angle. Hank wouldn't follow. He sat, eyes on the sky. I climbed, boots creaking on the rungs, and the wind was nil, the kind of stillness where a loose piece of hay will hang in midair. At the top of the ladder, the pulsing was clearer. The light in the sky was the size of my fist held at arm's length. Just a soft pale that didn't have color like red or green. It pulsed in a slow, steady pattern, one long, one short, two long, like sunspots breathing. Along with the pulse came a pressure change in my ears, a pop the way you feel on a plane. I felt a lightness, not in the head, but down behind the sternum, like someone had opened a window inside me and breeze had tugged at everything loose. I sat on the rung to steady myself, and for a second I thought about calling the neighbor Ed, but my phone wouldn't make the call. I can see his house from here. His porch light was off, and everything there looked normal. Then the roof's metal did something I hadn't expected. The entire top lip of the silo, the circular seam where the roof meets the cylinder, brightened in a pulse of reflected light that matched the sky. It was like someone had painted the rim with quicksilver and tapped it in time with the star. The metal didn't glow on its own, it flashed in that same slow rhythm. When the skylight held steady, the roof shimmered steadily. If the skylight cut out, the roof stopped. I climbed down and stood near the silo's base. I put my hand on the cool metal, expecting heat or charge, but there was nothing unusual, just the cold of the night and a little grit. I ran my gloved fingers along the seam. No scorch marks, no pits, nothing. It was untouched. I called to Hank to come and he rose, shook himself, and trotted over like he'd been pretending all along. The skylight hovered where it was for maybe 10 minutes. During that time, other strange, smaller things happened. The clock on the barn's alarm set jumped ahead a minute without ticking, then eased back as if it had settled. A tractor in the far field clicked into a higher idle, then back down for no reason. I watched a moth circle the floodlight, then stop midair and hang like a speck of dust. I felt both foolish and needing to know more. Maybe I could make it move if I waved a flashlight up at it, or maybe I could get a picture. I went back to the truck and dug for my camera. The battery read 87% when I checked. I clicked it. The display came alive, but when I pointed it at the light, the image was a smear of gray, like the sensor couldn't decide what to show. I took the shot anyway. Later, on the computer, the file was just a smear too. No evidence, only noise. And then it stopped. 1 second, the sky was pulsing. The next second, the light folded as if someone had pressed a hand over a lantern. The shine on the silo snapped out at the exact same moment. The air pressure returned to normal with the same little pop that had announced its arrival. The radio hummed back to life in the shop, and the barn clock ticked on without skipping. Hank barked once, short and surprised, then trotted in circles like nothing had happened. The night set back into its usual rhythm, and the stars resumed their steady, indifferent glitter. I walked up the gravel driveway to the house and didn't tell anyone right away. Why say something you couldn't prove? My wife would ask sensible questions, and Ed across the lane would say he'd been out splitting wood and never noticed a thing. I went inside, brewed coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my elbows on the wood until it stained my skin. The kettle clicked and the radio hummed with the local evening call-in show like it had before. I kept looking out the window toward the silo. It looked ordinary, plain under the moon, as if nothing extraordinary had just been projected across the metal. The next morning, I inspected the silo by daylight. I walked the ladder up and ran my hand along the seam, checking the bolts and the ring girders. Everything looked, to the eye, exactly as it had the week before. No burns, no pitting, no scorch marks. The men at the feed mill joked when I went in to buy a sack of mineral supplement. Trucks have mirrors that catch light, they said. Or maybe stray alley lights from the highway. Their voices made sense and filled the room. They'd seen odd reflections before, so had I. But those were ordinary explanations. But for a few nights after, when I took the last walk before bed, I'd find Hank sitting in the exact same spot, watching the west. He never howled, never barked. He just watched like a man staring for something he couldn't name. I kept waiting to see the light again, half hoping I'd get a better look, and half dreading it. It didn't return. The silo looked normal enough from the road, same rust streaks, same dent on the south side. The world kept its ordinary pace, feeding, milking, fixing fences, the things that have to be done whether the sky makes sense or not. I chalked the night up to an unexplainable scratch on the record of things that happen in a long life on a farm. I told Ed about the pulsing once over the fence, and he nodded, then changed the subject to corn prices, and the sound of him talking about the coming winter filled the space. I still go out to check the roof on clear nights. I take Hank because he likes the walk and because he's a sensible company. Sometimes I look up and search the west, where the light had been, and sometimes the stars are so sharp they seem to be cut with a ruler. Mostly there's nothing there but stars and the way they always have been. The roof glints in the moon now and then in the ordinary fashion, and I run my hand along the seam and feel the cold metal and the grit. And that's the story I keep. The night something odd lit the rim of the silo, and then it stopped, leaving everything appearing completely normal. I set out late that morning because the forecast had promised fog, and I wanted a quiet hike, the kind where the world gets soft and you only hear your boots and your breath. I was on the north side of Mount Alder, 10 miles in, single track that climbs and then plateaus along a ridge before dropping into the basin. The trail was slick with a week's worth of damp leaves and moss. The fog came down thick as I climbed, swallowing the pines, until everything looked as if someone had wrapped the woods in cotton. Up there alone, the usual noises faded. The creek in the wash was a low hiss somewhere below. The insects had gone mute. I like the fog for the way it cuts the world into small, manageable pieces, one step then the next. I'd been training for a 100-mile race, and the solitude felt right, like work you do on purpose. I hadn't gone more than a half mile on the ridge when I first noticed the sound, like a far-off generator or the low whine of an old elevator. It wasn't wind. The trees weren't moving enough to make noise. The branches hung with beads of moisture. The hum was steady and thin, a mechanical note pitched too low to tell where it was coming from. It had that quality machines get when they're under strain, the tonal wobble that says something is rotating. At first I thought it was a distant logging truck idling on some service road, but there was no road above the ridge that I knew of, and I couldn't place the direction of the sound. I stopped, dropped my pack, and listened. The hum seemed to come from all around and above at once, like being inside a bell. My ears ticked faintly, that pressure change sensation you get on long flights, and I felt the hairs rise along my forearms in a way that didn't belong to cold. I put my headlamp up and swept the beam through the fog. The light made the mist opaque in a circle and threw the trunks at the edge hard and close. No aircraft contrails, no blinking lights, nothing to explain the tone. Then, third odd thing, the chickadees went quiet. That's when you know the woods aren't behaving normally. Birds are stupidly honest sensors. When they stopped calling, the place lost another layer of sound, like someone was turning the night down. I checked my watch, altimeter working, my cadence steady, but the digital compass twitched like it was being nudged. I'd never had problems with the unit. I rarely relied on electronics, but I noticed small inconsistencies over the next few minutes. My GPS read a faint dot that jittered between points rather than a smooth track. My phone dropped from full bars to searching and then went black for signal entirely. I put it away because the cold made my hands clumsy, and the idea of trying to find reception on the ridge felt stupid. The hum rose a half tone, and the hair on my neck prickled again. I looked up. At first it was only shadow, an absence in the fog that moved. Not a beam of light, not the clear silhouette of a helicopter, but a broad, triangular dark that drifted through the mist above the treetops. It was the kind of shape you can see only because everything around it gives away its outline. The soft white of the fog stopping where the shadow was, a negative space against white. It moved, very slowly, like a curtain being pulled past a window, and it kept a steady height over the canopy. The edges weren't crisp, they feathered a little into the fog. It had no flashing nav lights, no strobes, nothing that would suggest a plane or a drone. The humming matched it, steady and low, as if the shadow and sound were married. For a second, I thought of a glider on a training run, or someone with a big kite. But there was no glider scent, no tension of a tow rope. I'd expected the shape to be bigger, to suggest scale like something the size of a small house, but in the fog, things compress. It might have been 60 feet across, might have been 200. The size didn't settle in my mind. What mattered was the motion, and that it was a shape that kept moving with intention, cutting through the mist. I fumbled for my pack and grabbed the little camera I bring for my blog posts, the one that usually shoots well in low light. My fingers were clumsy with cold and a kind of odd adrenaline. Nothing like fear, more a focused irritation you get when reality misbehaves. I snapped a picture. The screen showed gray static where the triangle should have been, like the sensor couldn't make sense of the negative space. I tried video. The camera recorded, the red dot pulsing its reassuring heartbeat, but when I looked at the tiny monitor, the footage was a smear of white with a darker streak that could have been anything. I saved it anyway, because you take records even if they lie. The shadow drifted across the trail at roughly the same speed as a person walking, maybe a bit faster, and every time it passed near the larger trees, I could see the undersides of limbs go momentarily gray, then back to white. A few pine needles fell in a sparse cascade, but they didn't rustle the way wind would make them. The air was still. I stepped off the trail a little and crouched behind a boulder, the way hikers do when they want to be less visible, less for any predator than because the action feels respectful, like not moving is a way to be quiet around something you don't understand. It came closer to the ridge, the triangular shadow skimming over the canopy, and the hum deepened like a chord descending on a piano. My ears popped again. I tasted metal for an instant, that zing you get when electricity is heavy in the air, although there were no power lines up there. A strip of fog beneath the shadow thinned, like a wind had passed through it, except I didn't feel any movement on my jacket. I thought about following it, head forward, camera up. A part of me wanted to run onto the ridge and stand right there under it and see if the hum changed, if the shadow had edges like a sheet, if it cast a proper silhouette. But other parts of me cataloged sensible things, steep drop-offs off the other side of the ridge, the way fog hides roots and rocks, the fact that my phone had no signal and there was no one to help me if I misstepped, so I stayed still. That seemed like the right thing to do then. I have a friend who's a forester, and he says you learn the difference between curiosity and foolishness by how cold you are and whether you can see the trail behind you. I was cold in the fingers and could see the next marker, and the ridge wasn't a place to do experiments. The shadow continued its slow sweep. As it passed over the trees, a pale impression moved across trunks in the way that light does when clouds drift, soft, not delineating. But occasionally the fog beneath the shadow bulged upward in a short, slow swell, like something underneath the mist was displacing air. It wasn't dramatic. It was incremental and almost polite about it. I told myself it had to be a localized weather microcurrent, a thermal, something I was fortunate enough to see because the fog made it obvious. My headlamp threw a narrow cone into the fog, and for an instant the triangle seemed to recoil slightly, not like an animal, but like an object aware of being looked at. My skin went prickly again. I had that dumb human thought where I pictured the triangle changing course if I moved. The birds occasionally change their flight if you step into their path. My feet were frozen to the rut in the trail, and my hands had the habitual tension of a hiker ready to move. Then the humming dropped in volume and the shadow thinned, melting into the fog as if someone had taken a sponge and dabbed the edge away. It didn't descend straight to the canopy. It simply lost shape, and the negative space that had been its outline filled again with fog. The sound lingered a second and then faded like a curtain closing. I didn't go after it. I waited until the hum had gone completely and the forest had regained its modest orchestra of frogs and a distant crow. My hands shook a little while I fumbled the camera back into my pack. The movement of my pulse seemed louder than ever when I put the pack on and clipped the strap. I told myself simple things. The fog hides 1,000 ordinary objects until you look at them the wrong way. The brain fills in patterns and makes faces and triangles where none exist. On the ridge, the markers appeared in the fog like punctuation, the blazes on trees giving me the comforting geometry of trail. My GPS snapped back to a steady dot as I descended. My phone found signal in a long, breathless sweep of 4G that made a text I'd tried to send earlier finally go through. I stopped twice on the descent to check boots and make sure laces hadn't come loose. Small, ordinary checks. The world had edged toward normal with every step. Back at the trailhead, the sun had worked a thin band through the fog, and the parking lot held the usual mess of muddy cars and sleeping packs. I met another hiker who asked how the ridge was, and I said, "Foggy, quiet." And he grunted and detailed the wrong direction for the climb, like he'd rather talk about footing than anything else. His face was ordinary and unstartled. I drove home with the windows cracked because the air in the cab felt warmer than the mist on the mountain. I told myself the triangle had been a gullible vision, the sort of thing you manage after being alone for too long with your thoughts. It was easier to frame it that way at first. By the time I pulled into the driveway and stepped up from the truck, I had rehearsed 3 different plausible explanations. A research glider, a kite from a nearby training field, a mirage caused by a thermal layer. None of them fit cleanly with the quiet pattern of the sound or the way the shape had moved through fog without wind. I told Jess, she's my partner, about parts of it when I made coffee. I left out the camera footage bit because it made me sound like I was making excuses. She listened quietly, then made some small joke about me getting mystical on the mountain, the kind of joke that keeps things angled toward normal. We didn't argue. I let the thoughts sit in my chest like a pebble. That night, I woke twice and looked at the window because a corner of the mist still lived in the hollows of my mind. I couldn't get the exact look of it right, the way the edges feathered, how it skirted the trees without hitting them. The image stayed like something in a photograph you can almost recall, but not quite. I kept thinking about the hum and the way the birds had stopped. I kept thinking about how slow it had been and how none of the obvious explanations lasted after you thought them through. I went back up the next week with better batteries and a different small camera, but the weather was clear and the ridge looked as it did in a postcard. I walked the same stretch and listened for the hum until my ears ached and nothing answered. The trees were themselves, the birds loud. Maybe it was a thing that passed once and left the world alone. Maybe it was something else. All I had was the ridge's wet footsteps, the faint silver of my breath, and a memory I couldn't quite pin down. I was walking home down County Road 9 because it was shorter and because I liked the way the lane narrowed between the old stone walls. It was almost 7 and the sky had that heavy, late October gray. No real sunset, just a slow, even dimming. The air had that wet, leaf-sour smell that comes right after a light rain. I had my jacket buttoned up and my scarf tucked in, my boots squished a little in the gutter where the leaves had gathered. Normally, I'd have driven, but the walk cleared my head after the clinic shift, and walking let me pass Mrs. Hollis's flower bed, which she'd never managed to give up even in November. The lane was quiet the way the far edge of town is quiet. No kids playing, no dogs barking, just the small sounds of things finishing their day. I passed the mailbox with the rusted flag, the paint warped by sun. Then, before I'd gone 50 yards more, everything that makes a country road sound like one did something that doesn't happen often. The birds stopped calling. Not a sudden chorus ending, but a cutoff, like someone had closed a book on the sound. The crickets, which had been loud as the light faded, went mute too. The silence hung for a second, and it felt wrong in the body, like a shoe gone missing. I heard the truck coming first, somewhere down the road, tires making that steady gravel chatter. It wasn't close. It sounded like it would pass long before it would reach me, but it didn't. The sound stalled and then faded as if the truck had turned on a side road that wasn't there. I stared down the lane for a second. The only lights were the yellowed bulbs in the farmhouse across the way and the dull glow from the little dairy a mile past the bend. The truck's sound never came back. A little farther on, one of the old birches dropped 3 leaves right in front of me, and they didn't fall. They hung there, stuck in the air, trembling like held breath. For a second, I thought the wind must have kicked up from the valley, but the leaves didn't drift. They just trembled in place and then, without a gust, let go and fluttered down all at once. I kept walking because you keep walking when you're on a road home. You keep the rhythm of steps, but my hands had started to grip my scarf tighter. My car was parked under the lone street lamp at the corner, my little silver hatchback with the dent on the rear bumper where someone had clipped me in the grocery lot months ago. I'd left the headlights on because I was going back to the clinic to grab a paperwork file, and I always did that in the dark, like leaving a candle burning on the stoop. The light pool around the car looked normal at first. White cones on wet asphalt, the shine on the hood, my reflection looking a little surprised as I approached. That's when I noticed the shadows. They were ahead of me, cast by nothing my headlights beam, and they moved the wrong way. A long, dark smear lay along the center line, a shadow the shape of a person stretching away from me. But there was nobody there. The hedgerow on the left, oak and hawthorn, cast a normal dark edge. But the shadow in the middle of the road seemed to slide to the right in a slow, fluid motion before it leaned left and then, oddest of all, lifted like it was being pulled upward. It wasn't the little jitter you get from a leaf or a loose sign. It was a clean, purposeful motion, like someone rehearsing a gesture and then deciding to do something else. My first reaction was practical. There must be a car further up the road, headlights behind something that threw a shadow forward, or a lantern somebody had left. I scanned the hedges with my eyes. Nothing. There were no flashlight beams, no reflections, no figure. The road was empty. My headlights kept painting the same wet ribbon of asphalt, the same fence posts, the same mushed grass beyond the ditch. But the shadow kept moving where nothing seemed to be. I stopped maybe 10 feet from the hatchback and, with the awkward politeness you develop for your possessions, shut my door with fingers that had gone a little numb. The dash light glowed, the little digital clock blinking 6:59 in that green LED. The radio was set to some low, late-night jazz I'd zoned out to leaving work. It hummed like it always did. I should have been comforted by those small, mechanical certainties. Instead, everything felt like a stage set where one prop had been rearranged without telling the actors. A small, bright thing moved across the passenger side windshield. It was dim, not more than a weak white, and it didn't make a sound. It slid in a slow arc from the base of the glass up toward the roofline and faded out as it reached the wiper blade. For half a second, the light seemed to silhouette something behind it, the suggestion of a gap in the dark like a coin pressed into velvet. I blinked. When I opened my eyes, the light had gone. Not snuffed out, but simply not there. Like a breath that had been there a moment ago and then returned to the room without making a sound. My mind tried to file it. A headlight in the distance, a late runner with a phone screen, a reflection from something at the dairy. None of that fit. If there'd been a car, the headlights would have shown up in my windshield as another set of cones, not as a dim, close ghost that drifted and then vanished. And if there'd been a person with a phone, the glow would have been steadier, the sort of thing phones do when you check a map. I reached for my phone to take a picture, and the screen flashed no service. The little bars gave up like they'd found a better place to be. My fingers fumbled. The glass felt colder than the air. I tried the camera anyway, aiming at where the glow had been, and the image on the screen came up gray and washed. No light, no shape, only the smear of wet road. I took 2 more pictures. Each time the live view looked normal, and the saved photo was an even wash of nothing. A quiet returned for a few breaths. The radio stuttered, soft, and then came back on, the sax now pitched a note lower. I told myself to get in the car and go. Drive slowly up the lane to the highway, keep the windows up, call the clinic if I needed a ride. I sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel and felt oddly exposed, like sitting under a naked bulb in a public room. My pulse had a small, steady rim to it. Nothing dramatic. No rush, just the attention that comes when something in the world moves out of pattern. Then the shadows did another thing. They did not return to normal. Instead, the long dark in the lane gathered along the gutter, pulling itself into neat, narrow bands that climbed along the hedgerow trunks like ivy. The hedges themselves didn't lean, they stayed still. The shadows climbed up and over and disappeared among the branches without any movement of the leaves. This was not a play of light from passing cars. I could feel the hair at the back of my neck stand up, a small static prickling that made me shiver even though the car was warm. I locked the doors, the little thunk sounding way too loud. I thumbed the radio off. The only sounds were my breathing and the faint tick of the cooling engine. Outside, the headlights still skated across the tarmac, clean and indifferent. Inside, the green clock moved minute by minute and seemed absurd in its insistence that time was nothing more than numbers. The glow returned, but not in the way you expect. There was no flare from the sky, no to and fro that gave anything away. This time it drifted slowly across the center of the windshield, a soft, diffused band that made the road ahead look like a sheet of old paper, edges slightly burned. It moved from left to right, close enough that I could see the wet catching the light and making a half arc. For a second, the glow hovered alongside the reflection of my hands on the wheel, and then it slipped past and was gone, swallowed by the night beyond the lamp pool. My phone chose that moment to chirp, and I nearly fell out of the seat, reaching for it. A text came through. "Kara, be home soon?" And I typed back, "On my way," faster than I meant to, thinking of how normal that answer sounded and how wrong it felt. I started the car and backed out of the lamp pool, my tires crunching on the wet leaves. I kept glancing in the rear view, half expecting to see the glow rising along the hedgerow or the shadows following, but there was only the indifferent sweep of my taillights receding. I drove slow, taking the road like a ritual, hands steady on the wheel, mind making a list of explanations, and then crossing them out when they didn't fit. I checked the mirrors to test my eyes. They showed nothing but the gloom of the lane and my own dim interior light. When I reached the highway, the town lights eased the edge of the dark, and the radio filled the car with talk of a game tomorrow and the weather. I called Kara from a red light because talking out loud to a person makes the world behave, and when she answered, her voice was the most ordinary thing, normal, familiar, patient, and it felt like a tether. At home, I left the headlights on long enough to fetch the mail from the box and then shut them off. I woke the porch light and let it pour the small square of safety over the walkway. The house smelled like the soup I'd made the night before, and the cat wound around my legs when I came in. I hung up my jacket, washed my hands, and made myself another cup of tea, even though it was late. I didn't tell Kara everything about the shadows and the glow. Not at first. I told her about the birds going quiet and the truck sound that faded and left me standing alone on the lane. She reached for my hand and said, "Maybe deer, maybe power lines acting up." She asked a question about the clinic and left it there. I told her the rest, about the headlights that showed nothing and yet made other things move, and she listened without a laugh, but with that look you sometimes get, part concern, part trying to understand. We talked almost in whispers because the house felt too small for big noises. That night, I left the porch light on until dawn. I woke twice with the impression that something had skated across the glass, and both times the house was quiet and ordinary. In the morning, I walked the lane with Kara until we got to the spot under the lamp, and we examined the hedgerow, the road, the gutter. There were no marks, no footprints, nothing a person or animal might leave. The leaves lay flat and sodden, and nothing seemed to have been moved in any way that made sense. I didn't tell anyone at the clinic. What would I say? That a shadow in the road acted like it was walking on its own, and that a pale light drifted past my windshield and then stopped existing? I wrote about it in my journal that evening, not as proof but as a ledger. Date, time, weather, small facts. Some nights the ledger is all you've got, a small, honest list that keeps you anchored. I keep expecting some simple answer to show up, an explanation that will fold the event neatly into the rest of life. So far, life is only its usual form. Errands, dinner, the way the cat bats at a sock. But every time I drive back down County Road 9 after sunset, I notice the way the lamp pool falls on the asphalt, and I check for the shadows. They might be gone. They might be waiting. I don't know which one is worse. I was on the porch with a thermos, and a pair of cheap binoculars because the sky was the kind you only get up where the trees thin and the light from town doesn't reach. It was late October, the kind of night that was clear and sharp and made the stars seem like somebody had thrown salt out over the world. I'd driven up to the cabin after work, the usual Friday thing. Get off the grid for a night, sleep with the windows open, let the city noise shrink to nothing. The cabin sits on a little rise about a mile from the nearest paved road. Behind it, the ridge drops into a stand of firs and spruce that edge a steep slope. You can see the tree line from the porch like a black comb against the sky. I set the thermos on the rail and leaned back, the wood cool under my palm. No one else was around. The neighbors were light years away in summer terms, but close enough in wilderness terms that you know they're there if something happens. My dog, Rosie, curled at my feet and sighed like she'd already made up her mind the night would be quiet. The first thing that felt wrong was small. The usual chorus of insects had thinned. There's always a sound, moths hitting the porch light, crickets with their tinny engines, an owl yodeling once across a valley, but that night the sound was spare, like someone had taken a few instruments out of an orchestra. I noticed, because I'm a night person, I notice sound the way some people notice weather. Silence in a certain place is a thing you can feel in your shoulders. I took the binoculars up to my eyes and swept the sky. The Milky Way looked like a smear of paint. Planets were hard, bright dots. The trees were black silhouettes with a hard edge. I could see the glint of the radio tower on the next ridge blinking its red light every few seconds. That was familiar and comforting in the way of fixed points. I watched it for a few minutes, not thinking about anything in particular. Work, the grocery list, the way my ankle flushed after yesterday's run. The porch light flickered twice and went steady. That was the second oddity. The bulb is an old thing. It blinks in storms or if the generator kicks on, but there was no wind and the generator hadn't run. Then the cabin's wireless router blinked its little blue LED like it does when something in the network coughs. My phone on the rail showed full bars, then searching, then nothing. I set it down and told myself it was a minor power quirk. I boiled off the worry and poured coffee into the thermos like you do because the action is sensible and the coffee is a small island of certainty. A red-tailed hawk called once from somewhere down the slope. It sounded like a question, not an alarm, and the sound hung and then didn't get an answer. That's when Rosie shifted and put her ears up. Dogs pick up on stuff before you do, I know that. She rose and padded to the edge of the porch, nose out, tail low but not tucked. She hovered there, not barking, not whining, just watching in a way that made the hair along my forearms stand up. I tried the binoculars again, moving my head slow so my eyes had time to catch on. Something moved across the tree line, just a flicker at first, like a deer shifting among branches. Then I saw the first light, a small pinprick that blinked once, twice, and then went quiet. It was low, right at the treetop level, like something moving just beyond the ridge. At first I thought someone on a far road had a flashlight or maybe a hunter with a headlamp, but there's no hunting allowed on this stretch at night, and the nearest road is far enough that a headlamp wouldn't look like that. Too steady, too exact. The light blinked again, this time in a pattern. One blink, pause, two blinks, pause, three quick blinks. I rewound the little protocol of my life and started matching it to things I knew. Morse came to mind only because you learn silly things when you grow up with a ham-op neighbor. I tried to count the beats to time them, and they didn't line up to any letter I recognized. They were too slow for electronic signaling and too regular for a creature's eyes reflecting. The pattern repeated a few times, then stopped, leaving a blank space like tape pulled from a cassette. I walked to the edge of the porch to get a better angle. The night smelled like wood smoke from some distant house, crisp, thin. The lights didn't move quickly. They hopped along the ridgeline, staying at treetop height, like someone was peeking over the edge and then ducking. There were 4 or 5 of them, spaced evenly, and they blinked one by one in a sequence that ran left to right and then back. Each pass took maybe 20 seconds. Before the first minute had passed, other small things happened. The old swing on the neighbor's porch, 2 properties over, swung slightly, though there was no wind. A loose shingle on the outhouse flapped in a way it had never flapped during heavy rain. The radio tower's red light, steady, dependable, paused in its rotation for about 3 beats and then resumed as if nothing had happened. I told myself to breathe. It's astonishing what you'll say out loud when you have no good explanation. I grabbed my phone and turned the video camera on. My thumb hesitated over the button because I knew how these things go. You try to catch proof and the device records nothing useful, or the file gets corrupted, or later you watch and wish you'd zoomed. I didn't want that, but I also wanted something to show my brother in the morning beyond the vague words I knew would sound like a foggy memory. The video captured the sky as I saw it, black and raw and dotted with stars. When I played back the clip with my finger on the glass, the tree line looked like a dark bar, and the sky was grainy white. The little lights showed up in the frame as tiny pinpoints in the right places, then blinked out. I saved the file, put it on airplane mode to conserve battery, and kept watching. The blinking held for maybe 10 minutes. It was methodical. Left to right, back again, then a longer pause and a repeat of the sequence. At one point, 2 lights blinked simultaneously, like a pause in a song where both drums hit. The pattern wasn't random. It had structure, like someone was sending a signal or rehearsing a rhythm. It didn't pan up and down. It clung to the treetops, like whoever or whatever behind the lights wanted to be seen and also wanted to stay out of reach. I went inside to get the old ham radio that sat in the drawer because it felt wrong to do nothing but drink coffee and watch lights. The radio is a beaten-in thing with a dial and a face you can read under a flashlight. It's not connected to the internet, and it works if the band is right and the atmosphere smiles. I tuned across shortwave and found only static and the soft scrape of distant weather channels. Nothing like a coordinated answer. I tried the VHF bands and got a farmer's bored voice about fertilizer and then static again. The radio didn't bring me company. It brought only the sense of being alone in the dark with the sky doing something deliberate. When the lights paused, there was that word again, pause. They held steady for what felt like several minutes. Frozen. The stars were steady above and the tower's red light was steady again, but the pinpricks at the tree line didn't blink. They hovered like breath held in a chest. The silence increased around me, and you can feel silence as a pressure if you sit in it long enough. I noticed my chair creak when I shifted. It sounded loud in that hush. Rosie whined once and then went quiet. I thought about walking the short trail down to the ridge, about getting closer to see if they were on posts or someone with a lantern, but the decision felt bigger than the distance. The night had closed slightly. Up close, the trees slope steep and the brush is full of roots and slick needles. I stayed. I sat with the thermos for company and watched the pattern hold. Then, without acceleration, without a rush or sound, the lights blinked out. One by one, they simply stopped blinking. The sequence ended like a sentence dropped mid-word. The dark, where they'd been, stayed black for a second, and then the sky right there filled in with the same unremarkable stars as around it. The tree line returned to being a silhouette. The soundscape returned, an industrious, small insect noise that filled the gaps and made the night ordinary again. The porch light's little flicker came back to normal. The router's LED blinked reliable again. My phone crept back to 1 bar and then a full signal, as if a curtain had been raised on the world. I sat with my hands around the thermos and thought through the normal explanations. Hunters, no. Flares would have been too bright and smoky. Drones, there's hardly the signal out here, and even then they'd have made noise or moved differently. Power company testing, maybe, but I'd have heard something from town. Satellites, no, they don't blink in little treetop patterns and then pause. The obvious answers had holes the size of a fist. I slept badly. I lay awake for hours, listening to the real noises of night reclaim the sky. Rosie slept hard and snored softly. Morning came on slow and ordinary, the sort of non-event that makes you second-guess the night before. I made coffee, played back the video file again, and watched the tiny lights flicker across the bottom of the frame in their pattern. It was there, stubborn and small, and nothing in the frame explained why they blinked or why they stopped. I called a neighbor at noon just to check. "Did you see anything?" And he laughed and said he was busy with the tractor and that the clouds had been moving funny. He hadn't seen lights. The perception of things changes in daylight. My brother said when I told him over the phone that evening, maybe weather balloons, maybe lens flares. He's practical. He wanted coordinates and a sketch, and then he wanted to argue about whether I should have gone down to the ridge. He didn't offer an answer that made sense either. I went back to the porch that night because routine is a useful thing when your head is full of small mysteries. The sky was different, a little cloudier, and the tree line was just that. Trees. Nothing pulsed. I poured a second thermos and watched until the hour I usually go to bed. Nothing returned. Maybe whatever it was had been passing or practicing or testing. Maybe it had been nothing at all. Maybe it had been something I was part of seeing in that private way we're sometimes part of a moment and other people are not. I keep the video file on my phone. Sometimes I pull it up on a slow evening and watch those tiny pinpricks blink across the black, slow and deliberate and without explanation. It sits there like an odd mark in a life you can't quite fit into a drawer. I go on with the work and the errands and the weekend hikes, but every now and then when the sky is clear and the town lights are small, I find myself on the porch again, binoculars at my face, waiting to see if the pattern will start over. The first thing I heard was the trees, not the normal creak and whisper you get when the wind comes through a stand of oaks, but a low, rolling rustle like something heavy moving through the canopy. I was kneeling by my pack, sorting shells into the old plastic tray, and the sound made me look up because it didn't match the weather. The forecast had been clear and bone dry, and the little stars we could see between branches. Did you hear that? Marcus said before I could say anything. He was 2 stands over, sitting in the folding chair a little too still, elbows on his knees, eyes on the dark line of trees above us. Tyler laughed once, a short bark, then shut up when the sound rolled again. It wasn't a wind. It wasn't any animal either, not like anything we'd heard on 100 trips out here. It was deep, like the ground itself was shifting a layer up in the air. We were out by the old logging road, a place Ben knew from his dad's maps, a ridge above the beaver pond. Moon was high and clean, the kind of night that makes every breath taste metallic. There were 5 of us in the group that weekend. Me, Marcus, Tyler, Ben, and Luis. We had headlamps and 2 handhelds between us, a cooler with too much beer, and a thermos that someone kept insisting had coffee and was only ever a little warm. The dogs, Moxie and Ruck, were tied to trees a little way off, more interested in scents than sounds. The moving sky sound came again, higher this time, like something huge and soft rolling by overhead. I stood up, the plastic of my shell tray snapping under my hand. I craned my neck so far I felt the old stiffness in my shoulders. The sky above the tree line was a clear black wash, stars everywhere. Nothing moved except the flakes of birch bark disturbed by our boots. I pointed stupidly, because pointing feels like doing something, but there was nothing to point at. Probably a crop duster, Tyler said, and we huffed out a laugh that wasn't really a laugh. Nobody was spraying anything out here. The nearest fields were miles away, and anyway, the sound had been too slow and too close to be a plane. We were hunters. We spent half our lives learning the shapes of noises, the rat-a-tat of squirrels at dawn, the distant drumming of woodpeckers, the rumble of traffic. This wasn't any of those. It had weight. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. A text from Maria. You going to be late? The sort of check-in that makes you feel sensibly tethered to the normal world. I thumbed it and set the phone on my knee and forgot about it. Marcus's radio crackled, a cheap handheld that he kept for emergencies and for bad weather. It was on the low channel that picks up nothing most nights. The static was steady, the little white sheen you get when a radio is on and lonely. Then, without a step or a sign, every light went out. Not just ours. The 3 headlamps blinked once and died. The 2 flashlights on the ground clicked off. Marcus's radio popped and went quiet. My phone screen darkened like someone had pressed a switch. The thermos of coffee went silent, the dog's small whines cut off mid-bark. For a beat there was nothing but the sound of our breathing and the sort of hollow ringing you get after a sudden silence. "Shit," Ben said, but his voice sounded small in the dark. We fumbled. Tyler's hand found his rifle by habit, and then he dropped it because he couldn't see the strap. Ben smacked at his headlamp and cursed. Luis swore in Spanish and then laughed, but it was the wrong kind of laugh. The glow-in-the-dark strips on the radios went dull, like someone had lowered the whole world's brightness knob. The sky above the trees was still clear. I kept wanting it to be clouded or full of some obvious machine to explain the sound. And there it was, a perfect ring of stars, and yet there was a pressure in the air I couldn't place. My ears felt full, like they'd gone underwater for a second. We called out to each other because that's what people do. We called the dogs. We shook flashlights and put them to our eyes, and still nothing would take. Marcus patted his pockets and threw the radio down on the cooler like it had betrayed him. Electrics, he said. Transformer, line, something. He was trying for calm and only halfway getting it. Maybe a storm cell up the valley? There were no clouds. You could see the Milky Way like a spilled ribbon. The dogs whined and then were quiet. For a minute I thought maybe the city a dozen miles off had some outage and the power draw around it had a ripple effect. Some grid thing we'd all read about and not believed. But phones and radios going at the same instant, in a pocket and in a battery, that sync felt too clean, too deliberate. We stayed there, the five of us, listening to the forest go back to its versions of normal. I could hear leaves settling, the soft drag of a branch against another branch. Then, from the woods behind the pond, something moved. It wasn't footsteps, it was broad and slow, like the sound of some animal the size of a truck shifting in the dark. Moxie strained against her rope and Ruck's leash snapped taut. Both dogs started barking in small, sharp bursts, then stopped because there was no echo back to them. Luis whispered, "Bear?" But under his breath and speculative like a ghost word. We had bears here, yes, but not the thunderous breath overhead. The movement sound was closer to the clouds than the ground. It was as if something vast had passed above the treetops and had the weight of a weather system. It made the hair on my arms stand up in a way I don't notice unless I'm cold or scared. I wasn't cold. I tried the phone again. Nothing. Battery icons that had been half full were dark. My watch's little digital face froze. The truck's distant headlights on the logging road were still where they'd been when we'd left it, a pale pin. I put my hand on Marcus's shoulder because small physical contact does something to fear. Then the dogs went still. That silence felt like someone had muted the world. I could hear my own pulse in my ear. The forest had a rounded hush to it. Not the sharp noises of prey and predator, but a smothered quality as if a blanket pressed the sound down. In that hush, the something that had been moving overhead stopped. The pressure did too. Nothing else happened. Minutes skated by. No radio, no phones, the glow strips black, our flashlights dead. We sat there on cool folding chairs, trading looks. By then, the beer in the cooler tasted like metal, and the thermos was for show. Marcus finally took a breath and laughed. The kind of laugh people use to mark that they're still okay. "Okay," he said. "Lights are back soon." They weren't. That was the hard part, the waiting. We were used to things going wrong out here. Rain that floods your boots, a battery that won't take a charge. You adapt. But this didn't feel like any of that. This felt like a gap in things where things used to be. After a long stretch, Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny keychain LED he'd forgotten he had. It sputtered once and died. He threw it into the dirt like it had stung him. Tyler found a lighter and lit a little candle he'd tucked into his vest on a whim. The flame held steady in a way that was almost comforting. The flame's light made shadows on our faces that didn't move. For a second, everybody's shadows looked like the faces of animals. We debated leaving. My truck was a mile down the logging road. The tires left a neat, pale path through the grass. If the radios were down and phones were fried, driving out was the best move. But who wants to walk to a truck in the dark when something unseen decided to silence your electronics? Luis said he'd walk. Ben would go with him. Tyler wanted to wait until daylight. Decisions made in the dark never feel right. Before Ben and Luis could get up, the radio crackled like a match finally struck and popped to life in Marcus's hands. Static, high and thin, and underneath it the faintest whisper of a voice that might have been ours had we been smarter. Marcus swore and hit the button, and the little channel opened up with nothing but a tone, then quiet again. My phone vibrated and lit up like someone had flipped a switch in the night. Maria's text read, "You okay?" And it felt like the smallest miracle. Everything came back at once. Not gradual, it was like a sudden flood. Headlamps blinked and shone. The two handhelds popped with static and then settled. The thermos hissed as if letting air out. The dogs went mad with barking and the forest joined them, a chorus of small noises that sounded almost embarrassed to be doing anything at all. We didn't talk much after that. Not because we were full of explanations, we had none, but because the world had resumed and it felt rude to demand a reason. Ben and Luis went for the truck. We packed slowly, eyes frequently on the tree line like people waiting for an encore. Nothing came down from the sky. Nothing trotted up from the pond. The logging road lay where it always had, and when we walked it, the dew on the grass glittered with the headlights in a way that seemed too ordinary. On the drive home, we all kept swapping bits and theories, the kinds of half-remembered articles about electromagnetic bursts, rare weather phenomena, satellites, military tests. Tyler said, maybe we'd all hit 8 hours without sleep and our brains had collectively hallucinated a sound. Marcus said, don't be an idiot. He had grown up around Kane County radio towers and knew the difference between interference and nothingness. Luis muttered about an old village story his abuela told, something about the sky breathing. I didn't sleep on Sunday. I kept replaying the way everything had cut out at once, like a curtain falling. The part of me that used to believe you could explain everything wanted a name to give it. Scientific words settle nerves. The part of me that leans on instinct knew that the name wouldn't change the thing. You can't unhear how the trees sounded when something huge moved. You carry the memory with you, folded into the small details, the way Ben tossed the dead LED into the dirt, the way Luis's whisper came out in Spanish, the way Marcus's radio came alive with a static that felt like a throat clearing. We met for beer the following week, because of course we did, as hunters and as friends, to check each other's eyes and talk like men who had seen something and were trying to reset the world to normal. We all agreed we'd tell whoever wanted to hear, but we kept the descriptions spare. A sound above the trees, everything electronic went dark for a minute, then it came back. No grand pronouncements, no attempts at cosmic sense. Sometimes, when I'm up at night and the house is otherwise asleep, I'll catch myself listening for the same low rolling sound. It hasn't come back, not really. But now, when a wind slips through the maples or the sky hums with distant traffic, I stop and check my phone with the radio and make sure the little lights are where they should be. It feels like a small, reasonable thing to do, like making sure your porch light is on before you leave. I was halfway down Maplewood, about 10 minutes into my usual loop, when every dog in the neighborhood started barking at once. I heard the first one, a sharp, angry yelp from Mrs. Calhoun's beagle, and figured it was normal dog noise, someone walking a late shift or a raccoon in the alley. But then the barking rolled out, layer after layer. The German Shepherd behind the Johnson's fence, the little yappy thing on Hazel Street that only ever barks at delivery drivers, the big lab 2 houses over that usually sleeps through anything. They all went off at the same moment, like somebody had flipped a switch. I stopped without thinking. My breath was a cloud in front of me. The morning was colder than I expected, low clouds and a dampness that made the roads smell like wet asphalt. I listened. The noise was steady and loud and fast. It didn't have the rhythm of dogs chasing something. It was the kind of barking that meant they were all reacting to one thing, all focused and furious and not moving from their perches. At first, I looked for a person on the sidewalk, someone in a hoodie walking a group, or a cat racing a fence. Nothing. I kept looking up. The sky was pale gray, not that light you get right before dawn, but that thin, even light that hangs over everything when clouds are low and the sun's not really trying. There was a single point of brightness moving slowly over the tops of the houses on the far side of the street. It wasn't a plane. No blinking red or white, no steady navigation lights. It was a pure, hard white, the kind of light that makes you squint. I thought maybe it was the fire tower out by the highway, but this was closer. It seemed to move on a straight line, but too slow. It was the wrong speed to be an aircraft and too steady to be a helicopter. When it crossed the line of the treetops, I could see it clear enough to feel that weird dislocation you get when something looks right and wrong at the same time, like a toy set up in a real room. The dogs went on barking for maybe 30 seconds, then got quieter, like somebody had told them to stop. Not all at once, but by degrees. The big lab's whining went down, the beagle's short yaps slowed. I don't know why I expected everyone else to be out on their porches, pointing the way people do with meteor showers, but the street was empty. No neighbors leaning on railings, no one running out in pajamas. It was just me, the dogs, and that light tracing the sky. I kept jogging because my legs felt like they were moving on habit. I didn't want to stand in the middle of Maplewood while something odd hovered above us. I passed the Petersons' house. Their porch light blinked off the moment the light in the sky passed over it, then came back on with a delay, like the bulb was sputtering. Their motion sensor didn't kick in. I glanced at the windows. No faces leaned to see. My phone was in my armband and I thought, stupidly, I should get this on video, because of course you do when you see something strange. I pulled the phone out, thumbed the camera, and the screen froze for a second. The loading circle spun, then the camera app crashed entirely. When it came back, the battery indicator dipped 3 notches, although I'd charged it the night before. I kept it in my hand anyway, because holding the thing made me feel less ridiculous than staring up at the sky like some kind of witness in a cheap thriller. The white dot moved and then stopped above the Thompson place, right where the big oak blocks the view of the houses behind it. It held dead still. The dogs' barking stopped completely. Even the birds shut up, those small nervous twitterings that start when one bird sees another bolting. The sudden silence felt like someone had muted the world. I could hear the distant rumble of a truck on Route 9, the hum of an air conditioner 2 blocks away, but every nearer sound, the loose chimney brick, the way it always creaks at night, the squeal the Johnson's gate makes when it swings, all of it stopped. I noticed my breathing loud then, and my pulse knocking at my throat. My legs wanted to keep moving, but my feet didn't. I watched the light and the small patch of sky around it, trying to find movement, structure, anything. And in the steady gray there was nothing. No rim, no shadow, just that hard, close white. It felt close enough to touch, like if I reached, I could press my finger against it and my hand wouldn't get cold. After a minute, the light moved again. It shifted maybe 10 degrees and then was gone. Not like a fade or a blink, but like someone erased it. 1 second it was there, framing the oak in a clean halo, and the next there was nothing but thin clouds and the first pale blue beginning to ease the gray. The dogs started up again, but quieter, as if they were checking their work. Not everyone went barking. Some were tentative, like they weren't sure the thing was really gone. A window on Maplewood, 3 doors down, opened, and Mrs. Calhoun stuck her head out, hair in a towel. She squinted up, then closed the window and pulled it down without coming out. My watch, an old analog thing my dad gave me, had stopped. It was odd enough that I noticed. The second hand had frozen, pointing at a number. The minute hand stubbornly decided to remain where it was. I had set it before my run and checked it at the car. It had been fine. Now it was stopped. I pulled it off and shook it and tapped the face with my thumb like a child trying to wake something up. It started again after a second, the second hand jerking into motion like a cheap clock that had been rewound. I walked the rest of my route with a tightness through my chest I couldn't place. The houses seemed the same, the cracked sidewalks the same, but the world felt smaller, as if something had skimmed across the top of it and left a line in it. I told myself I'd overreacted, that the dog's barking had made it worse than it was, made my senses tilt toward the weird, but I kept looking up until the treetops were behind me. When I turned onto South Ridge, the cul-de-sac where my apartment faces the park, every motion light on the street popped on for split seconds as if something had walked through them. The glow over the Thompson place hadn't reappeared. Nothing else did. It was an ordinary dawn that continued on like nothing unusual had happened. I unlocked my door with hands that felt colder than I expected and left my shoes where I always leave them. I thought about telling someone, but to who? The gym had a message board for morning runs, but sending an email that said, "Hey, did you see the light?" felt insane. The neighbor who worked nights would probably think I'd been drinking, which I hadn't, and Mrs. Calhoun would say it was a weather balloon or something mundane and sensible. Still, I didn't shrug it off entirely. Over coffee, I found myself staring out the window at the same slice of overcast sky, waiting for it to appear again. I put the phone on the counter and stared at it for a while, thumb worrying the side of it until a little groove wore into the skin. The camera worked fine. The battery read the same percentage it had when I left the house. My watch kept perfect time. The world was back on schedule. Later, on the walk to the train, I saw yards with the same pattern. A tuft of flattened grass, an overturned pot, something small and mundane that had been nudged but not violently. The Johnson's gate had a scuff on the lower slat. I could have sworn hadn't been there the night before. Maybe it had. Maybe it hadn't. Details that in bright daylight you could ignore still looked edged wrong. People mentioned the dogs when I passed them in the station lot. "My pups wouldn't stop this morning," one woman said. Her voice half laugh, half complaint. Someone else mentioned a house that had flickered on and off. No one said the thing I wanted someone to say, which was, "Did you see the light?" Nobody had. Or maybe everyone had, and was keeping it to themselves, which is its own kind of uneasy. I went back that evening because I felt like you were supposed to check the places that felt odd. The Thompson place was still a Thompson place. Rusted mailbox, hydrangea eaten down by last season's heat, a kid's scooter leaned against the porch. Nothing different where the light had hung. The big oak was full of leaves, and late sun made the same unremarkable patterns on the grass. Sometimes when I wake in the middle of the night now, I check the sky. It's not that I expect anything, more like I want to be proactive, to show the sky I'm on guard. Mostly there's just the same slow drift of clouds and, if I'm lucky, the low hum of a plane on its way to the city. I don't tell people about the stopped watch or the way all the neighborhood dogs barked like a chorus. It sounds small and silly, but small things echo in this town. You see the same faces at the same windows, the same cars parked on the same driveways. When there's a thing that doesn't fit, it makes the rest of the scenes show. I went jogging again the next morning, and the next, and for a week beyond that, and each time I kept lifting my head to the treetops like a child listening for a story. Sometimes the streetlights will stutter, or the dog across from me will start and stop, or my phone will blip at the exact moment I try to open it. Nothing like that hard white thing has shown itself again. I ran past the Thompson place last night on my way home. The oak threw a long shadow. Mrs. Calhoun's beagle was asleep on the porch, snoring quietly. The world went on, doing what it does. I don't have anything to explain what I saw. I only have the way it looked, the silence that followed it, and the knowledge that something was up there for a few slow seconds, bright as a coin, then not. I was crouched behind a fallen oak, the early evening fog settling in low between the pines when I first saw it. A pale, pulsing glow, weaving between the trees maybe 100 yards out. I froze, barely breathing, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and my own heartbeat. The light didn't move like a person walking or a flashlight beam. It danced, weaving in smooth curves, sometimes slowing, sometimes speeding up, never touching the ground. At first, I thought it might be another hunter. Someone out too late, maybe with a small lantern, but the motion didn't match anything human. It slipped silently through the woods, no crunch of twigs or brush, just this soft, almost liquid glow. I tried to track it with my eyes, adjusting my position to get a better look, but the fog made everything blurry. I lifted my rifle slowly, scope first, trying to get a closer view. That's when it vanished. One moment it was there, weaving just above the underbrush. The next, nothing. The space it had occupied seemed empty, but the fog hung heavy and my pulse started to hammer against my ribs. I lowered the rifle, scanning in a tight circle, ears straining for anything unusual. For a minute, nothing. Then I noticed the sound, or maybe the lack of it. All the usual forest noises had gone quiet. Birds that normally called as the sun set, frogs along the creek, even the wind through the pine needles, all gone. Complete silence, heavier than any night I'd ever spent out here. I felt exposed, like I was the only living thing in a still painting. I moved slowly, rifle raised, trying to get closer to where I'd last seen the glow. As I stepped over a root, a small flicker caught my eye. Just a glint of white light bouncing off something wet on a branch. I froze, trying to make sense of it, then realized it wasn't the same as before. It was static. A reflection maybe, but it made the hairs on my neck stand up. I kept moving, careful to stay in the shadows, following the direction I thought the light had gone. After 10 minutes, I stumbled onto a clearing. Nothing but fog and pines, and my flashlight beam cutting a narrow swath in front of me. I checked my watch. About 20 minutes had passed since I first saw the glow. That seemed off. I could have sworn only a few minutes had gone by, but the sky had darkened further, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. I leaned against a tree, trying to calm myself, when I noticed something odd. Tiny points of light, almost like embers, flickered in the fog ahead. They weren't moving like fireflies. They stayed in place, then blinked out one by one. I counted 3 before my flashlight battery buzzed low and dimmed, forcing me to switch it to a weaker setting. That's when I felt it. Not behind me, not to the side, but a sense of being watched. Nothing I could see, just awareness, as if something was tracking my movements carefully. I adjusted my grip on the rifle, feeling the weight of it steady my nerves, and started moving back toward the path. As I did, the fog thickened unnaturally, and the faint pulsing light reappeared for a brief second between 2 thick pines. I froze, scope up again, but as soon as I tried to focus, it vanished. The silence pressed in closer, and I realized I couldn't hear even the usual nighttime creaks of the forest floor under my own boots. I kept walking, slow, deliberate, staying alert. My mind raced through explanations. A strange reflection of the moon, bioluminescent insects, some kind of trick of fog and branches, but none of it fit. The way the light had moved, the absence of sound, the pressure of being watched, all wrong for anything natural I knew. By the time I got back to the main logging trail, I was shaking, but I told myself to stay rational. Maybe someone else was out here with a laser pointer or some toy. Maybe I just imagined parts of it, my eyes playing tricks in the fog. I even laughed quietly to myself, trying to break the tension. I kept checking behind me as I hiked back to the truck. Everything looked normal, shadows long and straight, fog thick but ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the light, whatever it was, had followed me in some way. I slowed every time a branch snapped underfoot, listening, expecting, but nothing. The truck came into view, headlights dim in the fog. I approached cautiously, scanning the tree line one last time. Nothing moved. I unlocked the door and got inside, leaving the engine off at first, just listening. The silence outside pressed against the glass, heavy and deliberate, like the woods were holding their breath. When I started the engine, the vibration of the idling motor seemed loud in contrast to the quiet. I looked in the rearview mirror at the fog-shrouded trees and couldn't see a thing, but I had the sensation that the glow was still out there somewhere, just beyond the edge of my vision. Driving out of the woods, I kept glancing at the side mirrors and over the roof, half expecting to see it again, weaving between the trees. But the path back was empty, the fog thinning, the forest returning to ordinary sounds. Birds called from the treetops, a distant branch cracked, a small owl hooted, normal again. When I reached my driveway, headlights cutting a path across the snow-dusted yard, I hesitated before stepping inside. My dog barked from the living room, breaking the tension, and I laughed, though it was shaky. I told myself it was just the fog, the fatigue, maybe a mix of imagination and stress from a long day hunting. I still think about it. Sometimes when I'm hiking, or even just sitting on the porch, I swear I see a flicker in the woods, subtle, just at the edge of sight. Not constant, not obvious, but enough to make me glance over my shoulder and feel that same watchful pressure. I've gone back to the woods since then. I bring a friend sometimes, lights, radios, even extra rifles. Nothing shows up in the same way. The fog is normal, the trees sound like themselves, and I feel almost foolish remembering that night. But every so often, in the right misty conditions, I catch a pulse of white moving against the dark trunks and my stomach tightens. And I know, in a way I can't explain, that whatever it was, it's still out there, weaving silently through the trees. We'd been driving up the winding road to our rental cabin in the Cascades for hours, the sun already dipping behind the peaks, painting the mountains in bruised purples and oranges. My wife, Lisa, and our two kids were bickering in the back seat over who got the last granola bar. I remember thinking how quiet it was once we finally turned off the main highway and onto the narrow, twisting road that led to the cabin. Trees pressed in on both sides, and the shadows were long and sharp, even as daylight lingered. When we pulled up to the cabin, the parking area was just a small clearing, gravel dust rising under the tires. I killed the engine and got out first, stretching, feeling the cool mountain air seep into my jacket. The kids scampered toward the porch while Lisa unloaded the cooler. The view from the cabin was what we'd come for. The valley below, thick with forest, fading into the evening mist while peaks curling like fingers into the clouds. We were unpacking when I first noticed it, this pale bluish glow over the valley. At first, I thought it was the fading sunlight, weirdly reflecting off the mist, but the angle was wrong. The sun had dipped behind the ridge on our side. There was no way light could have bounced like that. The glow was soft, diffused, like someone had taken a flashlight and smeared it across the fog, only it covered a much larger area than a handheld beam could. "Do you see that?" I asked Lisa, pointing toward the valley. She looked up from juggling coolers and grocery bags, frowning. "See what?" "The light, down there, over the valley." She turned, squinting, and her mouth went slightly slack. "Oh, wow, that's weird." The kids had now joined us, hopping around the porch railing, asking questions I couldn't answer. The glow was still there, pulsing subtly, like a heartbeat under the mist. I grabbed my camera from the bag, hoping to catch it, thinking a photo would make sense of it. But by the time I wrestled the lens out and turned it on, it had shifted. The edges were soft, blurred against the clouds rising from the valley floor, and then, in less than 30 seconds, it was gone. Just gone. I lowered the camera and rubbed my eyes, blinking rapidly, thinking maybe it had been an odd reflection, something with the mist catching the last light. Lisa shook her head, unsettled. It was too big, too bright, and there was nothing else. No fires, no trucks, nothing. We spent the next few minutes just staring down at the valley. The clouds hung low now, dull gray, normal, ordinary. The air smelled damp, earthy, and untouched, like it always did in these mountains. But the feeling lingered, an odd tension, like the valley had been holding something back. Later that evening, after we'd settled inside and the kids were asleep, I stepped out onto the porch again. Moonlight was weak, filtered through a thin layer of clouds. I half expected to see the glow return, maybe in the same place, maybe somewhere else. Nothing. The valley looked normal, the trees motionless. A deer trampled through the undergrowth, startled, but it was the only movement. I stood there for a long time, cigarette in hand, listening to the wind in the trees, wondering if I'd imagined it. The next morning I went down the trail behind the cabin, trying to get a better look at the valley. Everything was quiet, no signs of lights, fires, or any disturbance. I even checked the news, local reports, thinking maybe someone had seen something. Planes, helicopters, or anything. Nothing. Over the next few days, small things started to feel off. The fog rolled in thicker than normal, sticking to the cabin and trees, muffling sounds. At night, the wind sometimes carried a low hum, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me pause on the porch. The kids never noticed. The hum was too quiet, too odd to register as anything natural. And sometimes when I glanced down the valley, the clouds seemed wrong, like they were shifting in ways that didn't match the wind, curling against gravity just a little too perfectly. On our last night there, Lisa and I were sitting on the porch, cups of coffee cooling in our hands. The valley was hidden behind clouds, shadows pooling between peaks. I told her about the feeling I'd had the night before, the hum, the shapes in the mist, the way the trees sometimes seemed to tense. She nodded, not saying much, just letting the wind blow through her hair. I thought about the glow a lot on the drive home. I tried to reason it. Sunlight scattering weirdly, fog refracting the cabin's porch light, some distant campfire. But nothing fit. I've been back to that area in daylight since, trails mapped, peaks counted, valleys measured, and everything is as it should be. Completely ordinary. Yet sometimes late at night, I think about that glow, how it pulsed, how it seemed to linger just above the valley floor, quiet, patient, then dissolving into the clouds. and I wonder if it's still there, waiting, shifting with the fog, moving when I'm not looking, a presence too subtle to name, but real enough to make a man question the world he thought he knew. Even now, when I see mist rolling through a forest or fog settling over a valley, I check the edges of the clouds, half expecting that pale bluish light to reappear, slow and deliberate, hovering where it doesn't belong. And each time I realize I'll never quite know if I saw something extraordinary, or if my mind simply played a trick that felt far too vivid to ignore. The memory of that night lingers more vividly than the vacation itself, a quiet, haunting reminder that even in the most familiar landscapes, something can exist beyond explanation, waiting in the fog.